A cast iron pan slams down on a kitchen stove. The clang travels through the whole house. On the porch, a hired hand's boot scrapes the boards. He does not look back. Wide shot. Montana Territory, autumn 1876. A small wood frame house on the eastern edge of a town called Birch Fork. Yellow cottonwoods bending in the wind. A wagon at the gate. Two hired hands loading a chest of drawers that does not belong to them. Closer, inside the kitchen. A man in a Sunday coat weeps at the table. He is not the one being wronged. Closer still. A young woman stands at the stove. 20 years old. Large, wearing her mother's gray wool coat. Her hand rests on the pan. She has 34 cents in her pocket. Her father has been dead 4 days. Somewhere past the ridgeline behind that house, a cabin nobody wants is waiting. A trap has been set. It has been set for years. She does not know it yet, but she is already walking. The 3 silver dollars hit the auctioneer's table so hard they bounced. One rolled, wobbled, fell flat on Andrew Jackson's stamped face. The crowd of 40 men and 6 women went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something happens that nobody rehearsed. Every eye in Birch Fork turned toward the back row, toward the large young woman standing alone with her hands still open above the coins. She was 20 years old. She was wearing her mother's gray wool coat that had been let out twice at the seams and still pulled across the shoulders. She had 34 cents left in her pocket. She had a mule she did not yet know was hers, and she had just spent her last $3 on 40 acres of mountain property that the county assessor had described in writing as structurally compromised water source, unverified, no road access, apparent value negligible. The auctioneer looked at her, looked at the coins, looked back at her. Then Horace Glassmeyer laughed. He was standing 4 people from the table in a wool overcoat that had cost more than her father had earned in a good month. He turned to the man beside him and did not lower his voice. "My dear child, you cannot possibly be serious. That property is not suitable for a young woman of your particular circumstances." Dimity Larch did not look at him. She looked at the auctioneer. She said only one thing. "That cabin is mine." And every single person in that room was going to remember the exact moment she said it. Because before this day was finished, Horace Glassmeyer would understand, though he did not yet, that he had just made the second worst mistake of his life. The first one he had made 2 years earlier on a moonlit ridge above Cutter's Creek. But we are getting ahead of the story. Let us go back, 3 days back, to a small wood frame house on the eastern edge of Birch Fork, Montana Territory, where a 20-year-old girl sat beside her father's body and did not cry because she had used up every tear she had during the 2 nights before. Herod Larch had been a carpenter. He had built the house he died in with his own hands the year Dimity was born. He had built the crib she slept in. He had built the kitchen table where her mother had taught her to read from a hymnal, 1 letter at a time, between the coughing spells that got worse every winter until the winter. Dimity was 11 when they stopped altogether. He had built the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, the porch swing, the bookshelf he could not afford to fill with books. He had built everything in that house except the stove and the windows. I had died on a Sunday. Lung sickness, the doctor said. The same as her mother, only slower. 9 years slower. 9 years of Herod working for the Glassmeyer-owned lumber concern, breathing sawdust and the wet cold of the mill floor until his lungs finally gave out the way his hands had never given out. For 3 days, Dimity sat with him. She washed his face on the first day. She trimmed his beard on the second. On the third, she simply sat because there was nothing left to do and nowhere else to be, and no other person on the earth who required her presence for anything at all. She was not lonely. She was something worse than lonely. She was uncounted. And then on the 4th morning, her Uncle Barnabas rode up in a wagon with 2 hired hands and a letter. He did not knock. I walked through the front door of the house where his brother had just died. He set the letter on the kitchen table. He pulled out a chair. He sat down. He worked his mouth around a sentence that would not come. He looked at his hands. He tried again. The property, your daddy's property, it comes back to family. That's just how it... He stopped, started once more and gave her the number that was actually the reason he had come. She had until noon. Dimity was at the stove with a cast iron pan in her hand, not because she was hungry, because her hands needed something to hold, or they were going to shake themselves loose from her wrists. She set the pan down, not gently. The clang of iron on iron rang through the kitchen, and one of the hired hands on the porch flinched hard enough that she heard his boot scrape the boards. Her voice when it came was level. She had learned young how to keep her voice level. She had learned it the way a large girl in a small town learns most things by having no alternative. Her father, she reminded him, had been dead 4 days. 4 days, and her uncle had walked into her father's house, which was her house, and had told her she had 3 hours. Barnabas Larch was 52 years old and had spent 40 of those years being smaller than his younger brother in every way that mattered. He had spent the last 3 of them being deeper in debt than he had ever confessed to anyone, including his wife. He looked at the girl across from him, and he did not look at her long, because looking at her was one of the things his life had not equipped him to do. Nobody was saying she was not a good daughter to him, he offered. Dimity told him nobody had said anything about her at all that she would want to keep. She said it flat. He fell back on the law. Family property. That was how it worked. She told him there was no such law, and that he knew it. He did not answer, because he did know it, and because knowing it did not change what he had come to do. She wanted to throw the pan at him. She wanted to throw the pan at Horace Glassmeyer. She wanted to throw the pan at every person in Birch Fork who had ever looked at her the way Uncle Barnabas was looking at her right now, like she was a problem that had been temporarily tolerated and was now at long last being correctly handled. Instead, she told him quiet to get out of her kitchen. She would pack. She took 4 things. She took the quilt her mother had sewn during the last summer before the sickness, stitched with rose vines that had gone gray from washing. She took the small photograph of her father in his wedding suit standing beside her mother, both of them looking directly into the camera with the serious expressions people used to wear in photographs because a photograph was a serious thing. She took her grandmother's Bible with her grandmother's handwriting in the margins in 3 different languages, and she took the cast iron pan, because she had bought that pan herself, with money she had earned taking in laundry from the age of 15. And because nobody, not Uncle Barnabas, not a lawyer in Helena, not the family, not the law was going to tell her that the pan belonged to an estate, she walked out of the house at 11:45 in the morning carrying those 4 things. The hired hand stepped aside for her. Uncle Barnabas did not come to the door. She heard him behind her, still sitting at the table, weeping. She did not turn around, because she had learned young that a man who weeps while he is taking a thing from you is a man who has already forgiven himself for taking it. And she was done, completely done, with men who forgave themselves in advance. The walk into Birch Fork was 3 miles down a dirt road she had known her entire life. It was the 16th of October, 1876. The cottonwoods along Miller's Creek had turned gold. The sky was the enormous wash blue that Montana does in autumn, when the sun is bright and the wind still remembers summer but has already started planning something colder. Overhead, a pair of geese pointed south in the tired sideways line of a flock that had been flying since dawn. Dimity walked in the middle of the road because the middle of the road was flatter. Her feet hurt. Her back hurt. The quilt was heavier than a quilt ought to be. The Bible was heavier than a Bible ought to be. The photograph weighed almost nothing and was the thing pulling her arm down more than anything else, because a thing that weighs almost nothing can still weigh everything. She was not thinking about her father. She had used those thoughts up in the 3 days beside his body and the 4th day at the kitchen table with the pan. She was thinking about arithmetic. 34 cents. She had counted it twice. No relatives left who would take her in. Her mother's people were all in Iowa and had stopped writing after the funeral because grief made them uncomfortable, and Dimity had failed to comfort them by grieving quietly and prettily the way small girls were supposed to grieve. Her father's people were Uncle Barnabas. No work. The Glassmeyer mill did not employ women. The dry goods store had a girl already and would not take a second. The Miller family kept their own washing. The Reverend's household was staffed by the Reverend's cousins. And the school which she had briefly imagined teaching in during a small, stupid, hopeful year when she was 17 had made it very clear that a young woman of her appearance would not be suitable as a model for young ladies of impressionable age. Impressionable age. The Reverend's wife had used those exact words. So Dimity was thinking about arithmetic. Because arithmetic did not care about her appearance. Arithmetic said 34 cents. Arithmetic said she needed shelter by nightfall. Arithmetic said no arrangement she could imagine covered both of those facts. She reached the edge of town, and the whispering started. She had known it would start. She had timed her walk to arrive at the hour when Main Street was busiest, because if the whispering was going to happen, and it was going to happen, she would rather have it happen all at once than piecemeal for a week. Poor thing. Did you hear what Barnabas did? Well, what was he supposed to do? Girl can't run a household. Girl can't run anything at that size. The words landed on her the way small stones land on a large stone. They did not move her, they marked her, which was worse. A man she did not recognize said quite clearly to another man she did not recognize either that she wouldn't have lasted anyway. Not with the shape she was carrying. She kept walking. She did not turn her head. She did not slow down. She did not reach for the retort that was already forming in her mouth because the retort would have been the small thing they wanted and she was done. She had decided somewhere between the second-mile marker and the town limit, done giving small things to small people. And then she saw Mabel Tipton. Mabel was standing outside the dry goods store with a basket over one arm. She had eaten at the large kitchen table 40 times if she had eaten there once. She had borrowed sugar. She had borrowed flour. She had sat in that kitchen and cried once about her son who had gone west to California and never written. And Dimity's mother had held her hand, and Dimity had made her tea, and Mabel had said, "I don't know what I'd do without you people. I truly don't." Mabel Tipton saw Dimity coming. Mabel Tipton turned her head. Not down, not away in a way that could be mistaken for anything else. She turned her head deliberately toward the storefront window. She lifted one gloved hand and adjusted her hat. She stood like that until Dimity had passed. That was the moment. Not Uncle Barnabas, not the lawyer's letter, not the men on the street. That was the moment that went into Dimity's ribs and stayed there. Because Mabel Tipton had eaten her mother's biscuits. Because Mabel Tipton had held her mother's hand. Because Mabel Tipton had known Dimity since Dimity was born. And Mabel Tipton had decided in the 2 seconds between recognizing her and turning her head that whatever was happening to Dimity today was not the kind of thing you associated yourself with in public. Dimity walked another half block before her legs remembered how to keep working. She sat down on the bench outside the general store. She set the 4 things beside her. She counted her money again. 34 cents, still. And then a shadow fell across her lap. The woman standing in front of her was small, maybe 5 feet tall in her boots, 68, maybe 70. Silver hair pulled back in a bun that was neat but not fussy. Gray wool shawl, sensible dress. Hands that had done work, real work, laundry work, the kind of work that swells your knuckles and thickens the skin around your thumbnails. She did not smile. She did not sit down. She did not say hello. She simply set a small parcel wrapped in a clean white cloth on the bench beside Dimity. She set a wedge of pale yellow cheese next to the parcel. Then she straightened up, gave one small nod to nobody in particular, and turned to walk back toward the tailoring shop next door. Dimity found her voice before the woman reached the shop. "Ma'am," she managed. "I can't." The woman turned, halfway. She did not come back. She told Dimity over her shoulder in a voice that was warm and dry and completely without pity to eat it, honey. She had not asked Dimity's name. A person had a right to eat without explaining herself. And she went inside. Dimity sat on the bench with the bread and the cheese and the 4 things her father had left her by accident of not being able to take them into the ground. She unwrapped the parcel with hands that were suddenly, unexpectedly, humiliatingly unsteady. The bread was still warm. The bread was still warm. She put her hand flat on top of it, and she felt the warmth come up through her palm, and she thought quite clearly that she had not been given a thing without a price attached to it in 9 years, and that she did not know that woman's name, and that the woman had given her warm bread and had not asked. And a 4th thing arrived that she had not wanted to think, but which arrived anyway. That maybe she had been alone in a way she did not know how to see, and maybe that was why it was landing this hard. She ate half the bread. She ate a third of the cheese. She put the rest in her coat pocket for later, because later was still a category she had to plan for. She was folding the cloth to return to the woman when the bell rang. The bell rang at the courthouse 2 blocks north. She knew that bell. Everyone in Birch Fork knew that bell. It was the auction bell. County land auctions ran on the first and third Thursday of each month, and this was the third Thursday of October, and Dimity stood up from the bench without deciding to stand up. She started walking without deciding to walk. She had 34 cents in her pocket and half a wedge of cheese, and no reason on earth to attend a land auction where the smallest property in the county would sell for more money than she had ever held in her hand in her life. Except she was walking toward it anyway, because a girl with nowhere to be walks toward whatever is happening. Because the auction was noise and noise was not the bench. Because, and this was the smallest, most stubborn reason, the one she would not have named even to herself. Mabel Tipton's face had turned away, and Dimity Larch was not going to spend her first day of being nobody's daughter sitting still while other people decided who she was. She walked to the courthouse. She stood at the back of the crowd. The auctioneer was a Mr. Handley, thin and pink-faced, wearing a bow tie that had been in style approximately the year Dimity was born. He was moving fast. Most of the parcels went in under a minute. Grazing land north of the river, a quarter section south of the Miller place. A small building lot on 2nd Street that 3 men bid on with the sharp, bright competence of people who had money to lose and knew they were not going to lose it. Dimity watched the way the men talked to each other. The nods, the tilts of the hat that meant raise, and the small shakes that meant out. She learned the whole vocabulary in 11 minutes. She was about to leave because standing in the cold at the back of a crowd of men who were not going to notice she existed was, on reflection, not better than the bench when Mr. Handley reached for the next card and his voice changed. He read the card. He read it again silently. He cleared his throat. Next parcel, he announced, 40 acres, Upper Valley, former holding of one Osmond Frayne, deceased or absent. County had not been able to determine which with any certainty. A small ripple of laughter. He kept reading. Cabin on the property was described as he was quoting the assessor, here structurally compromised. Bigger laughter. Water source was a spring. Reliability unverified. No road access. No neighboring claims within 4 miles. A voice from the front wondered aloud whether it had been cursed by Osmond himself or whether somebody had gotten to it later. The laughter got loud enough that Mr. Handley had to raise his voice. Opening bid $1. The county had set the floor at $1 given the limited apparent value of the parcel. He looked around. Nobody moved. He looked around again. He was going once at no bid. Going twice, $3. Dimity heard her own voice say it before she felt her own mouth make the shape. The silence that followed was not the silence of 40 people who had not heard. It was the silence of 40 people who had heard perfectly and had turned as a single unit toward the back of the crowd to see who had said it. And then the parting. The crowd opened around her the way crowds do when something surprising has happened and no one wants to be the person in front of it. She walked forward through the parted space carrying nothing but her 4 things wrapped in the quilt. She reached the table. She set the quilt on the ground. She untied the small knotted corner of her handkerchief where she kept her coins. She took out 3 silver dollars. She placed them on the table in a row. $3, she told Mr. Handley without looking at Horace Glassmeyer, who she could feel 4 people to her left the way you feel a stove. That was the bid. Horace Glassmeyer laughed then. His dear child, he informed the room. This was not a suitable purchase for a young woman in her circumstances. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Mr. Handley. Bid stood, she reminded him. Her $3 were on his table. Mr. Handley looked at Horace. Because Mr. Handley was a man who had spent 30 years working around men like Horace Glassmeyer and had developed the habit of checking with them before making decisions that even remotely concerned them. Horace waved a gloved hand, a slow, disgusted, dismissive wave. The wave of a man declining to lower himself into a competition he considered beneath his notice. Let her have it, he told the auctioneer. Good God, let her have it. Mr. Handley cleared his throat. Going once. At $3. Behind Dimity, a woman she did not know said something under her breath that made the woman beside her giggle. Going twice. Dimity did not blink. Sold. To the young lady in the back. Mr. Handley asked her name. Dimity Larch. He wrote it in his ledger. He stamped a bill of sale. He counted the 3 coins into a small tin box. He held the bill of sale out to her. She took it, folded it once, then again, put it in her coat pocket next to the last piece of the older woman's cheese. She picked up her quilt. She walked out of the courthouse without hurrying. She did not look at Horace Glassmeyer. She did not have to. She had felt his laugh land against her back, and she had felt what it did not do, which was move her, which was reach her, which was change one single thing about the fact that she had just walked out of a courthouse with a bill of sale for 40 acres of Montana territory in her pocket. She was still walking, which was more than a lot of people had expected, and it was going to have to be enough for now. The livery stable was at the west end of Main Street, past the smithy, and past the empty lot where the second saloon used to stand before it burned in '73. Dimity walked in as the light was starting to go gray. The man behind the counter, his name she would learn later was Abel Voorhis, was old enough to be somebody's grandfather. He looked up. He looked at her 4 things. He looked at the way she was carrying them, which was the way a person carries things when the things are all the person has. He could rent her a stall for the night for a dime, he told her. She had 34 cents. A dime, miss. She knew what a dime was, she told him. She was telling him what she had, because she was going to need to leave in the morning, and she did not know how far she was going, and 34 cents needed to go a long way. Abel Voorhis looked at her a moment. He wiped his hands on his apron. Then she could keep her coins, he said, and she could sleep in the stall next to the gray mule at the back. And in the morning they would see what they would see. She stared at him. Why? Because. He did not say anything after that. He picked up a rag and went back to polishing a bridle. He did not look at her again. He was making it clear in the specific way of certain old men that the transaction was closed, and she could either accept it or argue about it, and he was not going to be moved by either. She thanked him quiet. He grunted. The stall next to the gray mule was clean. There was fresh straw. There was a horse blanket folded on the rail that was clearly there for her, because a horse blanket does not fold itself. The mule looked at her from the next stall with the ancient sideways, sad-eyed patience of a mule that has seen everything and has judged none of it worth commenting on. Dimity set her 4 things in the corner. She spread the quilt on the straw. She sat down. Then, alone in a livery stall in a town where her name that morning had meant Poor Herod's girl, and by nightfall meant the fat one who bid $3 at the auction, Dimity Larch put her face in her hands and did not cry. Because there was no one to cry to. Because she had already used up her crying. Because, and this was the truest reason, because the piece of paper in her coat pocket said 40 acres in one cabin and her name, and however small a thing that was, it was more than she had owned when she woke up that morning. She lay down on the quilt. The mule shifted in the next stall. All right, she whispered into the dark to nobody. She said it one more time. All right. She slept. She was awake before dawn. Abel Voorhis was already in the front of the stable when she came out with her 4 things folded and her hair braided flat against her head. He looked her over. He did not say anything about the sleeping arrangements. He walked to the back and untied the gray mule and led it out to her. His name was Chester. That was not her mule, she told him. He was now. She started to protest. Nobody had ever bought him Abel cut in. Nobody was likely to. He had come in 3 years back with a peddler who could not pay his bill and had left him as collateral. Peddler never came back. Chester ate about 4 cents a day of oats and did not move faster than a walk. But he would walk up any grade you pointed him at, and he would not quit before you did. Abel packed a small feed sack and set it across the mule's back. He handed her a lead rope. He did not know her property, he told her, but he knew that trail up past Miller's Creek, and he knew a horse would not make it, and a person on foot with 4 things and a quilt would not make it either. Chester would make it. She looked at him. She could not manage anything larger than telling him she had nothing to give him. Abel looked at his hands for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes had that gone somewhere else look that certain people get when they are about to say a thing that costs them. His mother, he told her, had been a large woman. He did not say anything else for a while. People had underestimated her whole life. He went on eventually. She had been smarter than any 3 of them put together. She had outlasted every one of them. He had been watching this town for 62 years. He knew what a laugh at an auction sounded like. He knew what one cost the person doing the laughing eventually. He touched the brim of his hat. The mule's name was Chester. His name had already been Chester when he got here. She was not to change it. He knew it. He turned and went back inside the stable before she could say anything. She stood in the pale early light with a mule she had not paid for and a lead rope in her hand. "Well," she said to the mule, "let's see what we've bought." The mule blinked at her slowly. Chester, as it turned out, did not disagree. The trail up past Miller's Creek was worse than the county assessor's description, which she had expected, because in Dimity's experience, official descriptions of hard things were always optimistic in exact proportion to how far the person writing them had been from actually attempting the thing. The road was fine for the first mile. It followed the creek. It was flat and stony, and the wind smelled of pine and cold water, and something faintly sweet underneath bruised aspen leaves maybe, or the last of some late-blooming weed she could not name. After the first mile, the road became a wagon track. After the second mile, the wagon track became a footpath. After the third mile, the footpath became suggestions. Chester walked without complaint. Chester also walked at exactly the pace Chester had decided to walk, and no application of the lead rope or her boots on the ground behind him made the slightest change to that pace. She stopped arguing with him around the third mile. She started walking beside him instead, matching his stride, and she discovered that if you let a mule set the pace, a mule will get you there, and you will still be able to breathe when you arrive. She stopped twice. Once at a small waterfall where she cupped her hands in the freezing creek and drank until her teeth ached. Once because her knees made a sound that concerned her, and she needed to give them 5 minutes of diplomacy before they escalated the situation to a formal complaint. She ate the last of the older woman's cheese sitting on a flat rock in the sun, with Chester breathing warm, wet mule breath onto the back of her neck. She was tired. She was also, for the first time she could remember since she was maybe 8 years old, entirely, completely alone, in a way that was not lonely. There was no one on the trail. There was no one within 4 miles. There was no one who had an opinion about the shape of her body, or the death of her father, or the disgrace of her uncle, or the $3 she had spent that morning. There was pine. There was creek. There was mule. There was sky. There was Dimity Larch. She got back up. She walked another 2 hours, and then she crested the last rise and she saw the cabin. She stood and looked at it for a long time. It was worse than the auctioneer had described, which meant it was much worse than the county assessor had described, which meant it was, and this was the part she had not been prepared for, real. It was a real cabin. It was standing. It had a roof, even if one corner of that roof had lost a decade-long argument with gravity. It had walls. It had a door. It had a stone chimney, and stone chimneys are the last thing to go on a mountain cabin, and this chimney was still there and still straight. The front porch had partially collapsed. Not all of it. Just the north corner, which had settled at an angle that suggested it had been considering the move for years and had finally, with some relief, committed. 2 windows on the east face were empty of glass and stuffed with rags. The rags had weathered to the color of the walls. There was a woodshed. The woodshed was upright. There was a small lean-to shelter to the north side that would do for Chester. There was, when she walked around a spring, not rumored, not hoped for, but actual running clear out of a rock face into a stone ring pool that someone had built by hand. Someone had built the pool by hand. She stood there staring at the pool a long time, because whoever had built it had chosen the stones carefully. The stones were the same size. They were laid flat. There was a small notch in the northern lip so that the pool would overflow in one direction and not flood the ground under the cabin. Someone had thought about drainage. Someone had thought about water in winter. Someone had thought about a person coming here and needing to fill a bucket without slipping. Someone had cared. Not recently, but once, and with intention. She led Chester around to the lean-to. She unloaded her 4 things. She walked into the cabin. It smelled of cold ash and old wood and dust, and something underneath both of those. Something faint and slightly sweet that she could not name, but that felt improbably like possibility. She stood in the middle of the room. The floor was solid pine boards. Someone had swept them a long time ago. There was a table pushed against the north wall. There were two chairs. There was a rope bed against the south wall with a straw tick that had gone gray with time, but had not gone to rot. There was a fireplace. There was a small shelf beside the fireplace with 3 tin cups on it, arranged neatly waiting. She set her 4 things on the table. She sat down on one of the chairs. The chair held her. The chair was the correct size. She was not going to cry over a chair. She was not. Except her hands were shaking again, the way they had shaken when she felt the warm bread through the cloth, and she had to sit very still for about a minute before she could stand up and start the fire. She built the fire. The chimney drew. She swept the floor with a bundle of pine branches because there was no broom. She unrolled her mother's quilt across the rope bed. She put the photograph of her father on the mantel above the fireplace, standing up against the wall. She put the Bible next to the photograph. She put the cast iron pan on the hearth. She stood in the middle of the room and she looked at what she had, which was a photograph of a dead man, a book of prayers written down before either she or her mother had been born, a pan she had bought with laundry money and 40 acres of Montana territory, with a cabin somebody had once loved. "All right," she said out loud to the fire. She said it one more time. All right. The days that followed would have broken most people. Not because the work was impossible, because it was relentless, because it was done alone, because there were hours in each day when the fact of her aloneness pressed down on her shoulders with a physical weight that had nothing to do with her size and everything to do with the ordinary human need to be seen doing a thing and to have the seeing confirm that the thing was worth doing. She had Chester. Chester witnessed everything with profound equanimity. Chester occasionally blew warm, damp air onto her hands when she was working with them in the cold, which she chose to interpret as encouragement. She fixed the porch first. She fixed the porch first because a collapsed porch was a daily insult, and she was done as of the morning at the kitchen table with the pan done with daily insults. She found lumber in the woodshed, old lumber but dry. She found tools hung in careful rows on the shed wall. The tools had been oiled, recently enough that the oil was still faintly present in the leather grip of the small hand axe. Someone had cared for those tools the way somebody who intends to come back cares for tools. She thought about that. She kept working. She re-chinked the walls where the chinking had failed, mixing clay from the creek bank with dry grass, packing it into the gaps until the cold air stopped finding its way through. She found 4 intact panes of glass buried in a debris pile behind the old outhouse, and she fitted 3 of them into the east windows and used the 4th to patch a crack in the remaining original pane. She learned the property by walking it. She walked a different section every morning before the light was full. She mapped it in her head. She noted where the ground was solid and where it was soft. She found a second spring on the western slope. She found trees marked at eye level with small notches that were clearly a trap line, though the traps themselves were long gone. She found on the north face, under a shelf of rock, 3 sealed clay jars and a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. She brought them back to the cabin. She opened the jars first. The jars held seeds, not random seeds, not the last dregs of somebody's garden. Labeled seeds. Each jar had a strip of soft leather tied around its neck with a name written on the leather in ink that had faded but had not disappeared. The writing was small, precise, deliberate. Squash, cold hardy, good above 6,000 feet. Beans, plant second week of May, no earlier. Potato, blue Peruvian, slow, good yield in hard soil. Someone had prepared this place, not abandoned it, prepared it for someone. She sat down on the floor of her cabin with the 3 jars in her lap. The wooden box held small garden tools, precise ones, the kind used for working in close rows. She turned the tools over in her hands one at a time. Someone had prepared this place, for someone. The thought would not leave her. It sat behind her sternum like a lit match. She stood up. She walked to the fireplace. She had been avoiding the fireplace in a particular way. Not avoiding using it, she had been building fires in it every day for warmth, but avoiding looking at it. Something about the way the stones on the right side of the fire surround had been laid. Something about the slightly too deliberate arrangement of the logs beside it. Something in her had been noticing for 2 weeks that there was more to that fireplace than there appeared to be, and she had been not looking because the habit of not expecting things was a habit she had been practicing for a very long time, and it was hard to break in one afternoon. But now she had 3 clay jars of labeled seeds in her lap, and the habit broke. She knelt by the fireplace. She ran her fingers along the logs of the fire surround. The logs were the same rough-hewn timber as the rest of the wall, except one. One log, third up from the floor, fit differently, not loose, not damaged, just placed. The way a thing is placed when it is meant to be moved. She worked it out of its position with the tip of her small hand axe. Behind the log was a compartment. The compartment held 3 things: a leather journal, a small canvas pouch, a folded letter sealed with plain wax. She sat back on her heels. For a long moment she did not touch any of them, because she had already understood before she picked up the letter, before she broke the seal, before she read a single word, she had already understood that the person who had prepared this cabin had prepared it for someone specific. And she was the someone. And that was a much bigger thing than a cabin, and a much bigger thing than $3, and a much bigger thing than anything she had ready to hold. She picked up the letter. The wax seal had no impression in it, just a thumb pressed flat. The mark of a man who wanted his letter closed, but did not want ceremony. She broke it. She unfolded the paper. She read, "If you are reading this, then the county has finally sold the place, and whoever bought it was willing to come up the mountain for $3 when everyone else in Birch Fork had already decided it was not worth their time. That tells me something about you already. It tells me you have either nothing left to lose, or you have more sense than the rest of them combined. Either way, you will do. My name is Osmond Frayne. I spent 31 years on this mountain. I came here because the people down in the valley could not figure out what to do with a man who did not fit their ideas of how a man was supposed to be. And eventually, I decided I would rather spend my time with mountains than with people who had made their minds up about me before they had bothered to look. I am writing this because I have no family left to leave the place to, and I am not young anymore, and I want whoever comes next to know that this mountain is not what they told you it was at the auction. The cabin is sound if you get the north corner of the roof sorted. The springs run good. The soil on the south slope is deeper than it looks. Build it up with compost for a season. It will feed you. The seeds in the clay jars will get you started. The second journal in this compartment has 30 years of notes about what grows and when, and what the weather does up here, and what it means when the elk come down early. Read it. Read it slowly. It is not a book you finish. It is a book you consult. I do not know who you are. I do not know what they said about you down in that town, or what you have been through to end up standing in front of a fireplace in a mountain cabin that nobody wanted. But I have learned one thing in 31 years of paying attention. The people who get sent away from the places they thought they belonged have a way, if they are stubborn enough, of building something better than what they lost. You are not a charity case. You are not somebody I feel sorry for. You are whoever was stubborn enough to climb this trail when everyone else laughed. That is enough. The mountain will do the rest. Osmond Frayne. Dimity read the letter through. She read it again. She put it down on the floor in front of her. She put her face in her hands, and she cried. Not the tight, controlled crying of a girl managing herself in front of people who were watching for weakness. Not the tearless 4-day exhaustion beside her father's body. Not any of the crying she had done since her mother died. She cried the full, unguarded, ugly, wet crying of a person who has been holding everything together for so long that the first moment of privacy becomes something else entirely. She cried for the kitchen table. She cried for Mabel Tipton's turned head. She cried for the man at the auction who said she couldn't walk the trail. She cried for her father and her mother and the 9 years of coughing at the mill for a lumber concern owned by a man in a wool overcoat. She cried for Uncle Barnabas weeping at her kitchen table while he took her house. She cried for every single morning of the last 9 years when she had gotten up and made herself small in some particular way to fit into a space that was never, regardless of what she did, going to be the right size. She cried until she was finished. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand. She picked up Osmond Frayne's letter. She folded it. She put it inside her grandmother's Bible next to the handwriting in 3 languages. Her grandmother's Bible was she understood a book for other people's important papers now. Her grandmother would have approved of that. She picked up the leather journal. She opened it to the first page. Year 1. First frost came early. Plant the beans by the second week of May. No earlier. She read for 2 hours. The lamp burned low. The fire held. Outside, Chester shifted in the lean-to and blew out a long, slow breath that might have been contentment or might have been the general commentary of an old mule on the state of the world. Either way, Dimity found it a comfort. She turned the page. She almost went to sleep with the journal open on her lap. She almost let the whole discovery settle at the size of a kind old dead man left me a letter and a garden book, which is more than most days have brought me. Almost. Except there had been a fourth thing in the compartment. She had noticed it when she took the letter out. She had noticed it, and she had set it aside because a rolled piece of oilcloth had seemed in that moment less urgent than a sealed letter. She had set it on the shelf above the door. She had not opened it. She stood up. Her knees complained about the change of position. She ignored them. She took the oilcloth down. She unrolled it on the floor beside the fire. It was not oilcloth wrapping around something else. It was itself the wrapping and the thing wrapped. It was a map, hand-drawn. Precise the way the seed jar labels had been precise. Small ink strokes, careful lettering, all of it clearly the work of the same hand that had written the letter in the journal. The map was of her mountain, her 40 acres, and the surrounding terrain, and the ridgelines, and the springs, and the trapline trees, and the position of the cabin marked with a small square in ink. She followed the map with her finger. She recognized it. She had walked this ground. It was correct. Except. Along the eastern ridge in 3 separate locations, Osmond Frayne had drawn the same small symbol. A circle, with a horizontal line struck through the middle of it. Beside each of the 3 symbols in letters slightly larger than the rest of the notation in letters that had been drawn, as though the person drawing them had wanted to be absolutely certain they could be read, even if the ink faded and the paper aged, and the person reading them was tired and cold, and did not know what she was looking for. Beside each of the 3 symbols, Osmond Frayne had written 2 words. Silver ore. Dimity sat back on her heels. She looked at the map for a long time. She looked at the letter folded into the Bible. She looked at the journal open on the floor. She thought about Mr. Handley's voice at the auction. Deceased or absent. County has not been able to determine which with any certainty. She thought about Horace Glassmeyer's laugh. Let her have it. Good God, let her have it. She thought about a man who had spent 31 years on a mountain, who had labeled his seed jars, who had oiled his tools, who had built a stone ring pool at the mouth of his spring, who had left a letter for the stranger who would come after him. She thought about a man like that going deceased or absent. She was very still. Outside, the wind had picked up against the north face of the cabin. The fire had settled into its second burn, the low, steady burn a fire goes into when you have stopped feeding it and have let it start living on its own coals. Chester shifted in the lean-to. The night was cold. You were not deceased, she said out loud to the fire, or to Osmond Frayne, or to her father, or to whoever might still be listening. And you were not absent. Quieter. Somebody made you both. The wind pushed at the north face of the cabin. The chimney drew. Dimity Larch, 20 years old, fatherless, houseless, holding a hand-drawn map of a silver claim in her lap, folded the map back into its oilcloth. She put it back in the compartment behind the loose log. She put the letter in the Bible. She put the journal on the shelf above the fireplace. She banked the fire. She lay down on her mother's quilt on the rope bed. She did not sleep for a long time, because she understood, now she understood, in the way you understand a thing when your body knows it before your mouth can shape the words. She understood that the cabin had not been a mistake. The cabin had not been an accident. The cabin had been a trap. The trap had been set for a very specific kind of person. Somebody desperate enough to bid $3 for a mountain nobody wanted. Somebody without options. Somebody who would either fail on the mountain and abandon the property and let the whole thing go quietly back through the county to whoever was waiting to buy it cheap and clean, or who would succeed on the mountain in ignorance, and who would eventually accept a very fair offer from a very reasonable gentleman in a wool overcoat and would be told she had been lucky and would sign a paper and would go away. The trap had been set for somebody who would not read the letter. She had read the letter. She lay in the dark on her mother's quilt in Osmond Frayn's cabin, and she felt the shape of the thing settle around her, the size of it, the whole cold planned length of it. A trap that had taken years to build, that had involved the county assessor and the auction floor, and possibly Uncle Barnabas, and definitely Horace Glassmeyer, and God alone knew who else, a trap that had needed one specific final piece. Her. A girl too poor and too desperate and too laughed at to be a real problem for anybody. They had been waiting for her. They just had not known she was the one they were waiting for. She turned on her side. She looked at the fire. You should not have laughed at me, Mr. Glassmeyer. The fire held. Outside high on the eastern ridge that she had not yet walked, the wind moved across a shelf of gray rock that had been quietly, patiently, for longer than anyone in Birchfork had been alive, holding a vein of silver bright enough to have already ruined at least one man's life. It was going to ruin a few more. Dimity Larch closed her eyes. She slept. The first hard frost came on the morning of the 3rd of November, and it came with a stranger on the ridge. Dimity was in the garden. She was 3 rows deep into breaking ground on the south slope, with the small, precise tools from Osmond's wooden box, working the frozen crust off the top layer of soil the way the journal had instructed. Break it in thin lifts. Turn under before the sun hits it. The mountain will tell you when it is ready. She had been on the mountain 20 days. Her hands had already changed. The calluses she had earned taking in laundry from the age of 15 had thickened into a different shape. A harder shape, the specific shape of a hand that has been swinging tools and carrying stones and holding a lead rope up a grade. She had lost a little weight and had gained a great deal of something else that she did not have a word for yet. The wool coat that had pulled across her shoulders in October now fit her the way clothes fit a person who has been using her back. She was thinking about the second bean row when she heard the horse. She straightened up. She turned. He was sitting on a roan mare at the top of the trail, perfectly still, watching her. Not the way a threat watches, the way a careful man watches a piece of new terrain that he intends to enter without alarming. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, that trail was not easy to miss," she told him. He had not come up here by accident. "No, ma'am." He swung down. I was maybe 30, lean, weather-worn in the specific way of men who worked outdoors and did not fuss about it. A jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 or 4 days. Eyes that were doing a thorough job of taking in the situation without appearing to do a thorough job of anything. She went back to her digging. She could feel him standing there working something out. She had learned at the auction and on the trail and inside the 20 days of being alone in a place she was slowly becoming the shape of that. The most efficient way to handle a man working something out was to let him work it out at his own pace and to continue doing whatever you had been doing before he arrived. After a while, he observed that she was planting. In November. Ground was cold, she told him, not frozen through. Osmond's notes said the south slope held heat later than it looked like it should. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. She had found his journal, he said. She stopped digging. She stood up all the way. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a second. And in that second, Dimity understood 2 things at once. The first was that this man had known Osmond Frayn. The second was that this man had known Osmond Frayn in the specific way of a person who was still 2 years later walking around with the knowledge of Osmond Frayn loose inside him with nowhere to put it down. He had told her instructions would be there, she offered careful. He had not told her where. Osmond had not been specific with anyone. The stranger returned. He believed in preparing things without telling, because a thing that was told was a thing that could be listened for. He looked at the garden rows. He would approve of this. She asked his name, Ansel Wheaton. He ran a small outfit 6 miles east. Osmond had been... He stopped. Started again. Osmond had been a neighbor of his in the way that word counted out here. Dimity looked at him a moment longer. There was coffee, she said, finally, if he wanted to warm up before he rode back. He did not want to impose. Then he shouldn't, she said. She had offered. He almost smiled that time. Not quite. Coffee would be good, he allowed. She made it the way she made it now. Strong. The way her father had never liked, and she had always preferred, and had never made in her own kitchen in her whole life, because her father had been the person the coffee was made for. They sat on the repaired section of the porch. Chester watched them from the lean-to with the mild expression of a mule who considered visitors to be neither an emergency nor a particular pleasure, and was therefore not going to allocate resources to either interpretation. They talked for 2 hours. She told him what she had done to the cabin. He told her about the mountain, which trails connected to which, where the elk wintered, where the creek ran dry in August. Which sections of the north face he did not recommend after heavy snow because the slope angle and the ice patterns created a hazard that was not visible until it was too late to matter. He listened when she spoke. He listened without performing his listening. He drank his coffee without complaint about the strength. When he stood up to leave, he mentioned he had 4 extra panes of glass from a window he had replaced last spring. No use to him. He could bring them up next week if she wanted them. She would be glad of them. He touched the brim of his hat. He mounted. He rode out. She stood on the porch and watched him go until the roan mare had disappeared into the timber, and the sound of the hooves had thinned into the ordinary sound of the mountain again. Then she went back to the garden, because the light was still good, and she had 2 more rows to turn before she lost it. It was only later, banking the fire for the night, wiping the pan clean, folding her mother's quilt back against the rope bed, that she realized she had spent 2 hours talking to a man who had looked at her exactly as much as he had looked at everything else. No more, no less. With the same careful attention he had brought to the question of the water table and the angle of the North Face Trail. He had not looked at her the way people in Birch Fork looked at her, as the primary fact about her from which all other assessments proceeded. He had looked at her the way Osmond Frayn's journal looked at the mountain, as a complex thing worth understanding. She fell asleep before she finished deciding what to do with that thought. Ansel came back the following Tuesday. He came back the Tuesday after that. He came back with the 4 panes of glass wrapped in burlap and lashed across his saddlebags. He came back with a sack of cornmeal he did not mention. He came back with a small wheel of hard cheese and a quantity of dried beans that he set inside the cabin door and also did not mention. So Dimity did not mention them either, because she needed them badly enough that pride would have been a luxury she could not currently afford. And because she understood without a single word being spoken about it, that Ansel Wheaton was not a man who required his kindness to be acknowledged in order to keep offering it. They fitted the glass panes together on the 4th Tuesday, working on opposite sides of the window frames, passing the putty knife back and forth. On his knees on the east side of the cabin, working the putty around the edge of a pane, he mentioned that she had been down to town. It was not quite a question. Tuesday was her supply day, she agreed. Yes, they were talking about her. She did not stop what she was doing. They had been talking about her since she was 12 years old. She asked what they were saying now. He worked another line of putty. Careful, he told her the polite version, that she would not last the winter. She waited, because that was clearly the polite version. After a moment, he told her the rest. Horace Glassmeyer had gone up to the county office last Thursday. She put down the putty knife. He had done what? He had questioned whether the auction had been properly conducted, whether the bid was valid, whether the property had prior encumbrances that were not disclosed at the time of sale. There were no encumbrances, she told him. She had read every line of that bill of sale. High knew that, and the county clerk knew that. But Glassmeyer had a way of making questions sound like conclusions, and he had men around him who had learned to agree with his conclusions before he had finished making them. She picked up the putty knife. She went back to work. Her hands were perfectly steady, which was interesting, because inside her ribs a small, fast animal had woken up and was pacing. Why, she wondered aloud after a while, would he care about 40 acres of mountain property that he had laughed at during the auction? Ansel did not answer for a long time. She glanced at him. He had stopped working. He was sitting back on his heels, looking at the horizon to the east, at the ridgeline that ran up past Cutter's Creek, and behind that to the higher country where the timber went from lodgepole to spruce. Because he told her at last, without looking at her, it was not 40 acres of worthless mountain property. At least. That was not all it was. She set down the putty knife again. She sat back on her heels too. He knew. He knew part. She waited for him to tell her the part. He turned his head then. He looked at her directly. He was working something out. She could see him deciding. Osmond had known something, he told her. He did not know exactly what. In the last year before he vanished, Osmond had been visited twice by a man from the Territorial Land Office in Helena. Osmond had told him not directly. Osmond never did anything directly one afternoon out in his tool shed. Ansel, this mountain is worth more than any of them know, and I intend for someone worthwhile to know it. Ansel had thought at the time he was just talking the way he sometimes talked, like he was leaving notes for a conversation he intended to finish later. He paused. Then he was gone. The wind moved once quiet across the east face of the cabin. Dimity heard herself ask how he had gone. That was the question. He did not know. He knew part of that too. She waited. He had looked for him for 2 weeks. He had ridden every trail on this mountain and the next one. He had filed a report with the sheriff in town. Nothing had come of it. The sheriff was a man who did his job well when the job was small, and who developed a sudden interest in his other duties when the job would put him crosswise of certain people. Ansel had understood that at the time. He had not been able to do anything about it at the time. He had been 28 years old, and he had just lost the closest thing he had to a father, and he had not had. He stopped himself. He started again. He had not had her yet. The sentence landed the way sentences land when they were not planned. He did not look at her when he said it. She did not look at him either, because there was a way in which the sentence had meant something very small. I did not have an ally then. I did not have a person to consult. And there was a way in which the sentence had meant something else entirely. And Dimity Larch, 20 years old, orphaned, laughed at, sitting on the east side of a cabin she had bought for $3 from a county that had not been able to determine whether the previous owner was dead or absent. Dimity Larch was not equipped in that moment to hold both meanings at once, so she held only the small one, for now. The journal, she told him, careful, might be worth reading again. All of it, very carefully. She nodded. He picked up his putty knife. They finished the window in silence. She read the journal from the beginning that night. She had been reading it sequentially. She had reached year 19 without finding anything she thought was more than what it appeared to be. Careful, specific, practical. The record of a man who had spent his life in close attention to one piece of ground. She read it differently now. She read it the way you read a letter from a person who knew someone was coming for them. She read it for pattern, for what he had chosen to write down, for what he had chosen to write around. She found the entries slowly, but once she started finding them, she could not stop. Year 22. The Eastern Survey crew came through again. Third time in 5 years. They always go up to the ridge and spend 2 days and come back saying nothing useful. I watch them from the timber. They are looking for something specific. They find it every time, and they pretend they have not. Year 25. A man named Renfred Fannin from the Territorial Land Office in Helena came to ask if I had received any formal survey notices. I told him no, which is true, because the surveys come through without notices, which I suspect is the point. He was uncomfortable when I said that. Uncomfortable men are informative. Year 28. Filed the mineral claim at the county today. Record number 1974 MC47. Paid the filing fee in cash. Did not use a lawyer, because I do not want the paperwork showing a lawyer's name and alerting people who watch lawyers the way hawks watch field mice. The claim covers the Eastern Ridge, specifically the 3 exposure points I mapped last spring. What is there is significant. I have seen the assay results from the territorial crew samples. They left a copy in the rocks above the second survey stake, which I do not believe they intended to do, but I took it and I have kept it because a man has a right to know what is under his own ground. She stopped. She read the entry again. They left a copy in the rocks above the second survey stake. I took it. I have kept it. Osmond had kept a copy of the assay report. Osmond had kept it somewhere. She looked at the compartment behind the loose log. She had already emptied it. Letter, pouch, journal, map, nothing else. Then he had kept it somewhere else, somewhere on the property. She was up before dawn the next morning. She rode Chester along the North Face connection that Ansel had described. She had waited 2 days for a break in the weather. The weather had broken on a Thursday. Clear cold. No wind. The kind of morning where the mountain sits perfectly still and lets you see every ridgeline for 20 miles. She wore every layer she owned. She still felt it at her hands, at her face, at the parts of her legs where the wind found the gaps in the wool. She reached the eastern ridge as the sun cleared the horizon, and she understood in one visual second what Osmond had seen, what the survey crews had seen, what Renfred Fannin had been uncomfortable about. The rock face on the eastern ridge had a particular quality at the 3 exposure points. A metallic brightness threaded through the gray stone, not visible at all times of day, not visible from below, visible now in the direct low morning light of a November sunrise, visible in the way certain things become visible only when the conditions are exactly right and the person looking has already been told what to look for. She was not a mining woman. She did not know the chemistry of what she was looking at, but she did not need to, because Osmond had left her the assay report. She found the second survey stake exactly where the map said it would be. A small metal rod driven at an angle into the rock so that it looked like a natural feature of the formation from more than 10 feet away. She almost missed it. She stood 4 feet from it, looking directly at it before her eye caught the machined edge. Above the stake in a crevice under a rock shelf that overhung the outcrop wrapped in oilcloth and tucked back where the weather would not reach it, she pulled it out. It was dry. It was intact. It was folded exactly the way Osmond had folded the letter and the map and every other thing he had left behind for the person he had been waiting for. She brought it back to the cabin. She read it beside the fire. The numbers in the report meant more to her now than they would have meant a month ago, because she had spent 3 weeks reading Osmond's journal and the survey copies from the county files and had developed by necessity a working vocabulary for what she was dealing with. What the report said in the specific technical language of territorial mineral assessment, over 3 pages with columns and abbreviations. What the report said in the end was this: the 3 exposure points on the eastern ridge of the 40-acre Frayne parcel contained silver-bearing ore at a concentration that the assessor had rated in a column labeled extraction viability as high. Dimity sat with the report in her lap for a long time. The fire ticked. Chester shifted in the lean-to. Outside, the November light moved across the floor of the cabin, the way November light moves thin and slow and honest. She thought about Horace Glassmeyer's laugh at the auction. She thought about Uncle Barnabas weeping at her father's kitchen table. She thought about Mabel Tipton's turned head. She thought about the county assessor's phrase, apparent value negligible. She thought about the words on the report in her lap, extraction viability high. She thought about a man who had spent 31 years on this mountain, who had figured out on his own what was in the rock, who had filed a claim for it under his own name, who had paid the fee in cash, who had told no lawyer, who had left the report in a crevice above a survey stake, because he understood. He had understood, sitting alone in this cabin, that a piece of paper hidden in the fireplace could be found by people searching a cabin, but a piece of paper hidden on the ridge could only be found by the person who had read the map, who had walked the trail, who had known where to look. High had built redundancy into his defense, like a man who knew he might not be there to defend it himself. She sat with that for a long time. Then she stood up and went to find her coat and went to find Chester's saddle, because there was a woman in town she needed to see. The older woman's laundry shop, she had a name now, Mercy Ballinger. Dimity had learned it over the 4 supply runs since October, sat between the Taylors and the Tinsmiths on the east side of Main Street. Dimity had walked past it a dozen times. She had not gone in. She had told herself she had not gone in because she had not needed laundry service. This was true, and it was not the reason. The reason was that the last time she had spoken to Mercy Ballinger had set a warm loaf of bread on a bench beside her and had not asked her name. And Dimity had not yet figured out what to do with a kindness like that. She figured it out on the way down the mountain. She tied Chester at the rail. She went in. The shop smelled of soap and starch and clean cotton and faintly of the wood smoke from the small stove in the back where they down the mountain. She tied Chester at the rail. She went in. The shop smelled of soap and starch and clean cotton and faintly of the wood smoke from the small stove in the back where the copper wash boiler sat. There were 3 lines strung across the ceiling with sheets hung on them. There was a counter. There were 2 flat irons resting on a stand. There was Mercy Ballinger folding a stack of muslin wearing the same gray shawl and the same sensible dress and the same unfussed bun of silver hair. She looked up. She saw Dimity. She set down the muslin. "Come sit down, child." Warm, dry, exactly the way she had spoken in October. She had been waiting to see if Dimity would come back to town on her own 2 feet. Dimity sat. Mercy went to the back of the shop and came out with 2 chipped cups of tea and set one in front of Dimity and sat down across from her. She had known Osmond Frayne back when Dimity's daddy was still in short pants. Dimity looked at her. Mercy sipped her tea. She had washed his clothes for 22 years. Every 2 months. He came into town, dropped his bundle, had a cup of tea with her, and rode back up. He was not a talker, but over 22 years, if a person shows up in your kitchen every 2 months and drinks tea and does not lie about the weather, you learn a person. And she had learned him. Dimity asked careful why she was telling her this now. Because 6 months before he went missing, Mercy told her he had brought her a package, wrapped in oilcloth, about this big. She held her hands apart, showing the size. He had told her, "Mercy, if some honest person ever comes into this shop asking about me, give them this. If nobody comes in 3 years, burn it and forget it." And then he had had his tea, and then he had ridden back up, and she had never seen him again. Dimity did not breathe for a second. Mercy set down her cup. She stood up. She walked to the back room. She was gone maybe 40 seconds. She came back with a package wrapped in oilcloth about the size a person's hands showed when they held them apart the way she had held hers apart. She set it on the table between them. "That had been 2 years and 11 months ago, honey." She had kept this package in a flour jar in her kitchen. She had moved it twice when she cleaned the shelves. She had never opened it, because Osmond had not told her to open it. He had told her to give it. Dimity asked why she had not given it to Ansel. Mercy looked at her a long moment. Because Ansel was a good boy, and she loved Ansel, and Ansel would have taken this package and would have ridden with it directly to the sheriff, and the sheriff would have listened to him, and the sheriff would have done what the sheriff was going to do, which was not what Osmond had wanted. Osmond had not wanted a report. Osmond had wanted whoever was honest enough to come find him on her own 2 feet, and that person had not come. For 2 years and 8 months, she had been 3 weeks from burning it, honey. She looked at Dimity across the table. Then she had seen Dimity sitting on that bench outside the general store with 34 cents, and she had given her the bread, because she had needed to see who Dimity was first. She had not given her anything else that day because she had needed to see. Now she had seen. She pushed the package across the table. "So, here." Dimity's hands did not shake exactly. They were very careful. She untied the oilcloth. Inside were 2 things. The first was a second copy of the assay report. Complete, multi-page, with the official Territorial Land Office seal stamped in the top right corner of the first page. A seal that was not on the copy she had pulled off the ridge, because the copy on the ridge had been a working copy left behind by mistake by the survey crew. This one was the filed copy, the one that was supposed to have gone into the county records and had somewhere along the way been substituted with a copy that had the mineral assessment section neatly omitted. The second was a single sheet of paper, a list. 6 names in Osmond Frayne's small, careful hand, people who have watched me, ordered by concern. 1. Horace Glassmeyer, the local piece. Do not underestimate him. He is not clever, but he is patient, and he has been paid to be patient. 2. Renfred Fannin, Territorial Land Office, Helena. He is the one who moves the papers. 3. A name Dimity did not recognize, Helena. He is the one who receives the papers. Do not confuse him with a businessman. He is a family member of number 1. This is not a business arrangement. It is a family arrangement wearing a business coat. 4. County Assessor's Office, Birch Fork, at minimum 1 clerk complicit, possibly 2. 5. Sheriff's Office Birch Fork will not act against numbers 1 through 4. 6. Whoever ends up bidding on this property when it goes to county auction may be an ally, may be a mark. Be careful. At the bottom of the sheet in slightly smaller writing, if you are number 6 and if you are reading this, then Mercy Ballinger has judged you honest and you are already ahead of them. Read the map. Read the journal. Do not go to the sheriff. Go to a lawyer named Julius Ardmore in Helena. He does not know me. He will not remember my name. But he handles mineral claims, and he does not take money from Glassmeyer's people. Tell him what you have. He will do the rest. Osmond. Dimity read the list twice. She read the bottom paragraph 3 times. I had known this was coming, she said finally without looking up. He had had this list ready 2 years and 11 months ago. I had had that list ready for a long time before he brought it to her. Mercy answered. Osmond Frayne had not been a surprised man. He had been a prepared man. That was why they had had to work so hard to make him disappear. And that was why they had been so willing to laugh at the auction. Because they had thought a prepared man had died without finishing his work. They had not known he had finished. They had not known he had left it in a flower jar. Mercy put her hand on top of Dimity's hand. She did not squeeze it. She just left her hand there. The way a person does when they mean I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and you may do with that whatever you find useful. Quiet Dimity was not a lone child. She had not been alone since the day she sat on that bench. She just had not known it yet. Dimity did not cry. She had used up crying 2 weeks ago on the floor of the cabin. But there was a place in her chest that had been cold for a very long time, and that place became briefly, unexpectedly, dangerously warm, and she had to sit very still for about a minute before she could speak. She needed to go to Helena, she said. Mercy agreed. She did. The report, the list, the journal, the map. Yes. She did not have money for the stagecoach. Mercy stood up. She went to the back of the shop again. She came back with a small tin. She opened it. She took out a bill. She set it on the table. $10, honey. That was the stagecoach both ways and a room at Mrs. Purdy's boarding house for 3 nights. It was not a loan. It had been Osmond's. Dimity looked at her. He had left her $12 in an envelope. When he brought her the package, Mercy explained. He had told her, Mercy, if the person comes, they will need to go to Helena, and they will not have coach fare. This is coach fare. She had kept the money in the tin behind the tin the package was in. She smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, dry, warm at the corners. She had told Dimity. He had been a prepared man. Dimity took the bill. She folded it. She put it in her coat pocket next to the map and the letter, in the assay report from the ridge, in the second assay report from the flower jar, in the list of 6 names. She stood up. Mercy, thank you. Mercy waved a hand. She was not to thank her honey. She had not done anything but wash a man's laundry for 22 years and hold a package for almost 3 and give a girl some warm bread. Dimity was going to do the hard part, so she was to go do it. Dimity walked to the door. She turned at the door. One more thing. Yes. Did she know the 3rd name on the list? Mercy's face changed then. Just a small change. The corners of her mouth flattened. She did. Who was he? Bertram Voss. I was Horace Glassmeyer's brother-in-law. He lived in Helena. He owned a controlling interest in a mining concern that had been quietly buying up mineral claims in the upper valley of this county for 6 years. Osmond had figured out the family connection about a year before he vanished. It was not something anyone in Birch Fork had ever put together, because Horace Glassmeyer went by his mother's family name, and Bertram Voss went by his father's, and nobody down at the county office had any particular reason to check the maiden name of Horace Glassmeyer's late sister. Dimity absorbed that. So this was not just Horace. No, honey, this was not just Horace. Horace was the piece of it that stood here in Birch Fork. He was the piece she could see. He was the piece she could, if she was careful, reach. But the money and the plan and the reach, that was Helena. That was Bertram Voss. Osmond had written it in the letter Dimity remembered quietly. This is not a business arrangement. It is a family arrangement wearing a business coat. Yes. Dimity opened the door. The bell above it rang. She said on her way out that when she came back from Helena, if she came back, Mercy should come sit at her table. She would like to make Mercy tea for a change. Mercy Ballinger smiled the way older women smile at younger women they have decided to keep. She would come sit at Dimity's table. Dimity walked out of the shop. She did not get 4 steps down the sidewalk, because Horace Glassmeyer was standing in the middle of Main Street. I was not walking, he was standing, which was a thing he did not do on Main Street. Horace Glassmeyer walked. He walked from his office to the mill, from the mill to the bank, from the bank to lunch at the hotel. He did not stand. He was standing today. He was watching the door of the laundry shop. He saw Dimity. He smiled. The smile did not touch anything else about his face. His dear child. What a small town it was. Dimity did not answer. She walked past him. She did not walk fast. She did not walk slow. She walked at the pace a person walks who is not going to give the person watching her the pleasure of seeing her adjust. He turned. He fell in beside her. He had been thinking about her situation up on that mountain. She was sure he had. Winter was coming. A young woman alone at that elevation. It was not a wise arrangement. She appreciated his concern for her arrangements. He had been authorized, he continued smooth, by certain associates who took an interest in developing property in this county. He had been authorized to offer her a very fair price for her parcel, enough to see her comfortably established here in town, in a small house, with some means of support. It would be a kindness to all parties. She did not slow down. She did not look at him. Quiet, how much did he know about what was on that property, Mr. Glassmeyer? She felt him flinch beside her. Just a beat. She had felt that beat once before, in a hallway. She had known the beat for what it was. It was the beat of a man reweighing. He recovered fast. Men like Horace always recovered fast. It was a difficult piece of land, he told her smooth. It was isolated. It was more than one person could reasonably manage. That was not what she had asked. His dear child. She was not his dear child. Her name was Miss Larch. He stopped walking. She kept walking. She did not turn around. Over her shoulder, loud enough that he heard, loud enough that the 2 men outside the bank across the street heard, she suggested he ask his brother-in-law and Helena. He knew more than Horace did. She did not look back. She heard very faintly behind her, nothing, which was the loudest sound she had ever heard Horace Glassmeyer make. She rode Chester back up the trail as the light started to slant. She thought about her uncle. She had been thinking about him for 2 days, because there was one piece of the picture that she had not yet placed, and the piece was Uncle Barnabas. Because Uncle Barnabas was not a bad man in the specific way Horace Glassmeyer was a bad man. Uncle Barnabas was a weak man, and a weak man does not on his own initiative ride into his dead brother's house 4 days after the death and throw out the daughter over a legal fiction. Somebody had put him up to it. She was sitting with that when she reached the cabin. She was still sitting with that 3 days later when the note came. The note came pinned to the door of the cabin at first light on Sunday morning. Handwritten. Uncle Barnabas's handwriting. She recognized it from a birthday card he had sent her when she was 7. Girl, I need to talk to you. Not in town. The old sawmill on Miller's Creek. Wednesday at noon. Come alone. Please. B. She did not tell Ansel. She did not tell Mercy. She thought about it for 2 days. She decided that a meeting requested by Uncle Barnabas at a location he had chosen was on balance a meeting she could safely attend if she went in with her eyes open and her expectations low. She went on Wednesday. She rode Chester down to the old sawmill. She left him tied at the edge of the tree line out of sight. She walked the last quarter mile on foot, because Uncle Barnabas might be a weak man, but weak men have people around them who are not always weak. And she was done. She had been done since October with being surprised. The sawmill was empty. There was one horse, Barnabas's bay, tied to a post. Barnabas was inside. He was sitting on an overturned crate. I was smaller than she remembered, which was strange because it had only been 6 weeks. He looked up when she came in. Girl, thank you for coming. She did not sit. Talk. He put his face in his hands. He kept it there for a long time. When he took his hands away, his face was wet. But he was not sobbing. He was doing something quieter, something worse. He was doing the thing a man does when the crying has been happening on the inside for so long that when it finally comes out, it does not come with sound. Horace Glass-Meyer had held a note on him, he told her quiet. $300. He had borrowed it in '72. He had never been able to pay it back. Horace had never asked all these years. He had held it over him. She waited. In September, he went on, 2 weeks before her daddy died. Horace had come to see him. Horace had said the note was going to be called. Full amount plus 12 years of interest. He had said the only way out was if he would sign a document when the time came, deeding the family property back to his line. She meant when the time came. Horace had known. Girl. He had known her daddy was dying. Everyone in town had known. Doc Prescott had told half the county by August. Horace had known, and he had timed the paperwork. He had had the lawyer's letter drafted before her daddy was in the ground. Why? That was the part. He put his hands over his face again. Muffled, he had not known why. He had not been able to figure why. Girl, his brother's house was not worth $300 on a good day. He had thought Horace wanted to sell it and take the profit. He had thought all sorts of things, and he had signed because he had been scared, because he had been going to lose the farm. Her aunt did not know. She still did not know. She thought the note had been paid. It had not been paid. It had just been held. Differently. Uncle. He had found out. Later. She waited. It had not been the house. It had been her. The wind moved through the open door of the sawmill. Horace had not wanted the house, he told her. He had wanted her thrown out of it, wanted her with nowhere to go and no money and no family that would take her in, wanted her desperate. Because desperate people bid at auctions on properties that other people had decided were not worth their attention. Horace had had the property. He had known what was on it. He had needed a bidder he could push around later. He had needed a girl who would fail on the mountain by December and would sell back to him in January, or who would take a settlement in the spring and go quietly. Dimity did not move. Girl, he told her. He was so ashamed. She still did not move. He was not asking her to forgive him. He knew what he had done. He had not known all of what he had done, but he had done enough of it. He was asking her to let him help fix it. However she would let him. If she would let him. She looked at him for a long time. Barnabas Larch, 52 years old, weeping on an overturned crate in a sawmill. Her father's older brother, her only living blood. Finally quiet, she would think about it, Uncle. He nodded. That was more than he had asked for. Thank you, girl. She turned to go. She stopped in the doorway. Without turning around, Uncle. Yes, I was going to fix it. He was going to fix all of it. But not on his terms, on hers. And when she told him what needed doing, he was going to do it, and he was not going to weep at her about it. Because she was done being wept at. She walked out. She did not look back to see whether he was still weeping. She did not care. The break-in came 2 nights after Helena. She had gone to Helena. She had ridden the stagecoach 2 full days. She had walked into Julius Ardmore's small, unmarked office on a side street 2 blocks from the territorial courthouse, and she had put every piece of paper she owned on his table. The bill of sale, the deed, the letter, the map, the pouch, the journal transcription in her own hand, the assay report from the ridge, the assay report from the flour jar, the list of 6 names. Julius Ardmore was a compact man in his 50s, wire-rimmed spectacles, economical movements. He had gone through every document once without speaking. He had gone through the second assay report, the sealed one, twice. He had looked at her over his spectacles the second time. Miss Larch, he had said, quiet. He did not know if she understood what she had brought him. She had some idea. She had brought him the case. She had hoped so. Not a case. The case, this report had an official territorial seal. It had been filed, which meant the copy in the county file with the mineral assessment omitted had been substituted, which was fraud, not a filing error. Fraud. with a paper trail, with names. He had leaned back in his chair. He knew Julius Ardmore did not sound like a man who got excited. But Miss Larch, he was excited. He had taken the case on contingency, 20% of any settlement or awarded compensation plus filing costs. From the first proceeds, nothing owed if they lost. She had signed. She had come home. She had come home on a Friday night tired to her bones, and she had gone into Mercy's shop first to tell her, and Mercy had told her, "Good honey, now sleep for 2 days." And she had ridden Chester up the mountain, and she had banked the fire, and she had slept. The break-in came Sunday. She was gone for the afternoon. She had ridden 6 miles east to sit on Ansel's porch and drink his coffee and tell him about Helena. She had come back at dusk. She saw the light through the east window from a quarter-mile out. She stopped Chester. She listened. Nothing but wind. She rode closer, slow. She did not tie the mule at the usual post. She left him at the tree line out of sight. She walked the last 100 yards on foot. The light in the cabin moved, the way a carried lamp moves, not the steady glow of the fire she had banked before leaving. She thought about riding to Ansel's. She thought about riding down the mountain and getting the sheriff who would not come. She thought about standing out here in the cold and waiting for whoever it was to leave. And then she thought no. Because Osmond Frayne had spent 31 years on this mountain preparing a defense for a person who might not be him. And she was that person. And that person did not stand in the dark, waiting for men in her cabin to finish going through her papers. That person walked into her cabin. She walked into her cabin. She did not knock. She pushed the door open. She stepped through. The man inside was not someone she recognized. He was going through the shelf by the fireplace, specifically the shelf where she kept the journal. He had a lamp in one hand. He was pulling papers out of a stack with the other. He was scanning them fast, the focused, fast reading of a man who had been told what to look for. He froze when she came through the door. Dimity crossed the cabin in 3 strides. She took the lamp out of his hand. Quiet, those were her papers. He backed up 1 step. He had just been going through her property, in her cabin, in the dark, with a lamp he had not brought in through her front door. She lifted the lamp so she could see his face. He was maybe 30, wearing the clothes of a man trying to look unremarkable. He was doing the arithmetic now. She could see him doing it. Large young woman standing between him and the door, lamp in her hand. There had been a misunderstanding, he tried. There had not. Who had sent him? Nobody had sent him. He had been passing through, and the door had been latched. He had broken the latch. She had seen it when she came in. So he had not been passing through. He had been sent. And she was asking him one time, who had sent him? He looked at the door behind her. She was not going to let him past her, she told him. And if he tried her, Mule was at the tree line and her neighbor was 6 miles east, and he was expecting her back in the morning, and if she was not back, he would know exactly where to start. That last part was mostly true. He looked at her. He looked at the lamp. Sullen, he did not know who had sent him. He got told. He did a job. He went home. He was to tell whoever told him. She paused. She wanted to get this exactly right. I was to tell whoever told him that the papers he was looking for were not in this cabin. They were with a lawyer in Helena. And the assay report that his brother-in-law's survey crew had left on the ridge by mistake in '74 was also with the lawyer, along with the sealed report that they had thought they had substituted out of the county file, and the claim record number that Osmond Frayne had filed, which was 1874 MC0047, which was now formally attached to her deed in the territorial record. He was to tell him all of that, word for word, and then he was to get off this mountain and he was not to come back. She stepped aside from the door. He did not move for a second, because he was still processing it. Because a person had walked in on him rifling a cabin, had taken his lamp, and had recited a string of specifics that a girl on a mountain was not supposed to know. Quieter, colder go. He went. She listened to his horse leaving the timber. She heard it go for a long time. She stood in the open door of her cabin with the lamp in her hand until the sound of the hooves had died completely. Then she pulled the broken latch closed as well as it would close. She built the fire back up. She sat down on the floor in front of it. She noticed shaking. Not badly, just a small clean shaking of a body that has been asked to do a thing it has never done and has done it and is now in the aftermath informing her that it had been afraid. She sat with the shaking until it passed, out loud to Osmond Frayne or to her father or to whoever was still in the room they knew now. They knew that she knew. She looked at the fire. Good. She wrote to Julius Ardmore before she went to bed. She wrote every detail, the time, the intruder, his face, his clothes, what she had said, what he had done, what she had said next, the exact words. She gave the letter to Ansel in the morning. He read it standing on her porch. He read it twice. He handed it back. Quiet, he would take it to town. And he would take a copy to a man in Helena she had not met yet. Who? Deputy U.S. Marshal Gibson Heath, out of the Helena office. He had worked a land fraud case in the Judith Basin the year before last. Ansel knew the family. Heath was not connected to any county network in this territory. He took unsigned letters seriously, and he would take a signed one from her very seriously indeed. Dimity looked at him. Ansel. Yes, he had been keeping the names of federal marshals in his head for 2 years. He looked at the horizon. He had, because he had thought this day was coming. He had hoped this day was coming. He had not known it would come with her. But yes, he had been keeping the names. She looked at him a moment longer. She did not say what she almost said. Instead, thank you. He touched the brim of his hat. He rode down the trail with the letter. She read the journal that night. All of it. She had been reading it in pieces for 6 weeks. Tonight she read it end to end. She read for 4 hours. Chester slept in the lean-to. The fire held. She reached the last entry. The last entry was different. The handwriting was different. Not the small, precise ink of the rest of the journal. Shakier. Larger. Written by a man whose hand had started to fail him. Written in pencil, not ink. Dated May 3 years ago. 6 weeks before he had brought the package to Mercy. I have finished what I can finish. The map is in the fireplace. The report is on the ridge. The list of names is with Mercy. Whoever is honest enough to come will find them. I have done as much preparing as a man can do. I want to say one more thing. Not to the county, not to Glassmeyer, not to Voss and Helena. I have said everything I have to say to them in the paperwork. I want to say a thing to you, whoever you turn out to be. I have spent 31 years on this mountain because down in the valley there was no room in the shape they cut for me. I did not fit. And instead of shrinking to fit, I left. And this mountain gave me the room to be the shape I already was. If you are reading this, then the mountain has done the same for you. Or it is about to. Do not shrink for them when you go back down. And you will go back down, because you are going to have to fight them where they live, not where you live. But do not shrink for them. Be the whole size of yourself, in their courthouses, in their offices, in their hallways. Let them look at the shape you already are. Let them do the shrinking, if any shrinking is going to be done. Osmond. Dimity read the last entry 3 times. She closed the journal. She put her hand flat on the leather cover. She sat by the fire for a long time. She did not cry. She did not have to. All right, Osmond. Quiet to the fire. They would go to Helena, and they would not shrink. The fire held. Outside Chester shifted in the lean-to. The wind moved once quiet across the eastern ridge, where a shelf of silver-bearing rock had been waiting patient for a very long time for a girl who had bought a mountain for $3 and had refused when it mattered to be a smaller person than the mountain had been waiting for. 6 weeks. That was how long Julius Ardmore said it would be until the hearing. 6 weeks of December bleeding into January. 6 weeks of the snow coming down harder and the trail getting worse, and Chester's breath making white columns in the cold air of the lean-to every morning when Dimity went out to feed him. 6 weeks of Ansel riding up the mountain twice a week without being asked. 6 weeks of Mercy Bollinger sending small parcels of food she called extras, even though they were not extras. 6 weeks of Dimity sitting at her cabin table at night, reading Osmond Frayne's journal a 4th time, a 5th time, a sixth time, marking passages with slips of paper, making her own notes in a new ledger in her own hand, because she had understood something. She had understood that whatever was coming at that hearing, the person who would decide the outcome would be a stranger, a judge she had never met, in a Helena courtroom that would not know what her cabin smelled like. Who did not know the sound Chester made in the lean-to at 4 in the morning? Who did not know that Mabel Tipton had turned her head? And the man on the other side, Porter Kilgore. Julius had said the name on her second day in Helena. Julius had said it quiet. They had brought in a lawyer from Chicago. His name was Porter Kilgore. He was very good. Julius was telling her because he had found that she handled information better than she handled surprises. Kilgore was going to try to make this case about her. Not about the deed, not about the claim, about her. About a young woman who had bought a mountain for $3 and had had the audacity to think it might mean something. Kilgore was going to paint that picture in every color he had. She needed to be prepared. Quiet, she had been being that picture since she was 12, Mr. Ardmore. Let him paint. But now at the cabin, 6 weeks later, she was less certain of the bravery of that sentence. Because the sentence had been true when she said it. And it was true now. And it was also in the way of true things insufficient. She had been a fat girl in Birch Fork. She had not been a fat girl on a witness stand. So she prepared. She practiced her testimony in front of the fire. She practiced it in front of Chester, who chewed and did not offer feedback. She practiced it in front of Mercy, who took notes in a small book with a pencil stub. At the end of the third rehearsal, Mercy told her slow it down when he got nasty, honey. When a man went nasty at a woman, the woman who won was the woman who went slower. She practiced it in front of Ansel, who did not take notes and did not interrupt. At the end, he told her only that she was going to be all right. She looked at him then. He looked back. Neither of them said the thing that had been sitting between them since he had told her he had not had her yet on the porch in October and had failed to look at her when he said it. They did not say it because there were other things that had to happen first. But Dimity noticed sitting there in her cabin with Ansel across the fire and the wind moving on the north face outside, she noticed that she had stopped being embarrassed by the not saying. She had started counting on it, which was maybe the most dangerous thing that had happened to her all winter. She thanked him. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. He rode down the mountain. She banked the fire. She went back to reading the journal. Horace Glassmeyer came up the mountain on the third day of the second week of January. Alone. He had never been up the trail alone. Dimity saw him from the garden. She was breaking up frozen ground for the last spring planting. Osmond's journal recommended working the small tools through the crust, the way she had learned. She heard the horse straightened up, turned. I was picking his way down the last stretch of the trail slowly, because his horse, a well-bred bay that had never been asked to do this kind of work, was picking its way slowly. He was, she noticed, less polished than usual. There was something working behind his eyes that had not been working there in October. He dismounted. He walked toward the garden the way a man walks who is here on specific business and intends to conduct it without unnecessary friction. Miss Larch. I had never called her Miss Larch before. She did not stop working. Mr. Glassmeyer, he had come all the way up. She had not expected that. He had wanted to speak with her directly, without lawyers. Her lawyer had advised her not to speak with opposing parties without representation. He was aware of that. He was asking her to make an exception. She stopped working then. She stood up all the way. She looked at him. I was standing about 6 feet from her, holding his horse's reins, wearing the same wool overcoat he had worn to the auction. It fit him more loosely. He had lost weight. In the 6 weeks since the intruder had come to her cabin, since Julius had filed the claim attachment notice with the territorial court, since Mercy had testified in a preliminary deposition and had spelled out the family connection between Horace and Bertram Voss. In those 6 weeks, something had begun eating Horace Glassmeyer from the inside. Quiet talk. He looked at his gloved hands. He looked up. The concern he was associated with was prepared to offer her a partnership. Not a buyout. A partnership. She retained the deed. They operated the extraction. She received a percentage of proceeds. 25%. Guaranteed. The number landed in the cold air between them. She thought about it. Not about accepting it, about what the number told her. 25% of a high-viability silver operation. She had done the arithmetic with Julius. 25% over the life of a claim of this scale was a genuinely large amount of money. It was more money than Herod Larch had earned in the whole of his life added together. It was more money than most people in Birch Fork would see if they lived to be 100. Horace was offering her 25%, which meant 75% was still in Horace's calculation worth the trouble of coming up her mountain alone in January, which told her what he thought 75% was worth, which was a very informative number. Mr. Glassmeyer, she began. His associate in Helena had sent a man to break into her cabin in November. Before that, he had sent her an unsigned letter suggesting she might not survive the winter. Before that, he had had Renfred Fannin substitute a copy of the survey report in the county file so that the property she had bought at auction would look like worthless land. She kept her voice even. She kept it exactly as even as she had kept it at her father's kitchen table with the pan in her hand. Before that, 2 years and 8 months ago, something had happened to Osmond Frayne, which was currently under investigation by a federal marshal out of Helena, and Horace was offering her 25%. His face did not change, but something behind his face did. She saw it. She had learned to see it. In the hallway of the county office, small, fast, the beat of a man reweighing. 25%, he told her, was a very generous number, Miss Larch. Given the difficulty of extraction, given the isolation of the property, given the difficulty a young woman would have in operating a mining concern in her own name. He should ask his brother-in-law how his difficulty was coming. She did not smile when she said it. She said it flat. He did not answer. He had told her at the auction that she could not walk this trail. He did not recall. He had said, let her have it. He had said it loud enough that she had heard. He had said it because he had already decided she would fail, which was the plan, which was the whole plan. Fail on the mountain, sell back, or sign a partnership at 25% for a claim he had known the value of for 3 years. She looked at him. Mr. Glassmeyer. She was going to say something to him now, and she wanted him to hear it, because she was only going to say it once. He waited. She would see him in a court, and she did not think he was going to like what happened there. He did not move. He stood in her garden for maybe 10 seconds without speaking. Then he turned. He led his horse back to the trail. He mounted with some difficulty because the ground was uneven. He rode out. She stood in the garden until the sound of the hooves had gone completely. Then she sat down on a flat rock and let her hands shake for exactly 2 minutes, which was the amount of time she had decided shaking was permitted. Then she went back to her digging, because there were 2 more rows to turn before she lost the light. Ansel came the next evening. He came with news. He came with his hat in his hand, which was a way he had never come before. He stood on the porch for a long moment before he spoke. Quiet, there was something he had not told her, and he needed to tell her now. Because if he did not tell her now, and it came out at the hearing, she was going to be blindsided, and he would not do that to her. Dimity's stomach dropped. In the specific way stomachs drop when a person you have started to trust warns you that the trust is about to be tested. Sit down. Ansel. He sat. She waited. Slow, there was a man. Lived above Cutter's Creek. Trapper. Ran his line up there for maybe 20 years. His name was Theo Halbrook. She had never heard the name. She would not have. He did not come to town. He had not come to town since '73. Osmond had known him. They had been. Ansel did not know if he would say friends. But they had known each other, in the way 2 men who lived alone on mountains 8 miles apart knew each other. They would meet at a creek crossing twice a year, compare notes on the game, trade tobacco. He paused. 2 years and 8 months ago, 2 nights after Osmond disappeared, Halbrook had come down to Ansel's place. Middle of the night. He would not come inside. He would not sit down. He had stood on Ansel's porch in the dark and had told him, Ansel, I saw something. I have not been able to sleep, but I am not going to tell you what I saw, because if I tell you, you are going to make me go to the sheriff, and the sheriff is not going to do a thing about it, and I am going to be a marked man in this county for the rest of my days, and I am not doing that, not for a friend who is already dead, not when it will not bring him back. Ansel looked at his hands, and he had left. And he had not left his cabin in the 2 years and 8 months since. Ansel had ridden up there 4 times. Each time Halbrook had come to the door and told him to leave. Each time he had said the same thing. I saw what I saw. I am holding it. Do not ask me to put it down where the sheriff can pick it up. Ansel looked at Dimity. I had not told her because he had not wanted her to build a case around a man who was not going to testify. And he had not wanted her to know there had been a witness and be unable to reach him, because that would have been a cruelty. And he had tried very hard not to be cruel to her. Quiet, Ansel. Look at me. He looked at her. She needed to tell him something too, and then she was going to ask him to do something for her. He waited. She stood up. She went to the shelf above the fireplace. She took down the journal. She opened it to a page she had marked with a slip of paper 2 weeks ago. She brought it to him. She held it open so he could see. The entry was dated March 12th, 1874. Met the trapper above Cutter's Creek this morning. Halbrook. Told him if anything happens to me if I do not show up at the crossing in July, then he should not go to the sheriff. He should wait. He should wait for the girl who comes for my books. He will know her when he sees her. She will not ask him to talk. She will only ask him if he wants to, because that is all he needs to be asked. Ansel read it. He read it again. He looked up at her. His face had gone slightly still. The specific stillness of a person who has just understood that a piece of the ground he has been standing on for 2 years is not the ground he thought it was. Osmond had known. Osmond had known there was a witness. Osmond had told the witness to wait. For her. He had not told him this. I had not told him because he was going to try to fix it, and Halbrook was not going to be fixed. Halbrook was going to be asked. By a person Halbrook could look at and think this is the one Osmond meant, and decide. Ansel put the journal on his knee. He looked at the fire. After a while, without looking at her, Osmond had been smarter than any 3 of them put together. Dimity. Quiet, she agreed. She knew. They rode up to Cutter's Creek 2 days later. It was the coldest morning of the winter so far. The kind of cold that makes the snow squeak under a horse's hooves. The kind of cold that gets inside a person's back teeth. Chester picked his way up the trail beside Ansel's roan mare. They stopped at a small clearing about 80 yards from Halbrook's cabin. Ansel gestured to it with his chin. It was small. Squared logs. A stone chimney with pale smoke going straight up because there was no wind. Ansel would wait here. She was to go on. She swung down. She walked the last 80 yards alone, boots crunching, her breath going out in white columns. Her 4 things well. Different 4 things now. Her deed, her copy of the claim number, Osmond's letter, and the journal page she had marked. She reached the door. She knocked. She waited. She heard nothing. She waited longer. She was about to knock again when the door opened. The man in the doorway was maybe 55, weathered dark, leather coat that had been restitched at the shoulders more than once, beard down to the second button of his shirt. Eyes that were doing the same work Ansel's eyes had done in October, taking in the situation without appearing to. Gravel-voiced, she was the one. Quiet, she was the one. He looked at her a long moment. Osmond had said she would come. He had said not before 3 winters, and no more than 4. This was the 3rd. She nodded. Osmond had said Halbrook would know her. She nodded again. He did not finish the sentence. He just looked at her. And Dimity, who had been looked at all her life in the specific way people looked at a large young woman in a small town, she understood in one whole clean second that this man was looking at her the way Ansel had looked at her in October, the way Osmond's journal looked at the mountain, as a complex thing worth understanding. Quiet, she was the whole size of herself, which was a sentence Dimity had not been prepared to hear, which was Osmond's sentence. Which meant Osmond had told Halbrook the sentence, which meant Osmond had been thinking 3 years ago about the exact shape of the person who might one day come up his mountain, which meant Osmond had been thinking about her, before he had ever met her, before she was even a possibility, before he had known if there would be a person at all. Osmond Frayne had prepared for her. She did not cry in front of Theo Halbrook. She could not. She was here on business. Quiet, she was not here to ask him to talk Mr. Halbrook. She was here to ask if he wanted to. He looked at her for a very long time. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in, girl." He would make her tea, bring her neighbor too. Ansel had been coming up this trail for 2 years asking the wrong question. He could come in for the right one. The hearing began on the 7th of February in the Territorial Courthouse in Helena at 10 o'clock in the morning. Dimity walked into the courtroom in her mother's gray wool coat. She had not bought a new coat for court. She had considered it. Mercy had offered to help her sew one. Julius had gently suggested that a somewhat different silhouette might be strategic. She had said no. Quiet, she was not going to walk into a room to be judged by strangers wearing something she would not wear to her own kitchen. If they could not look at her the way she already was, then their looking was not her problem. Mercy had smiled at her a long, slow smile. Julius had told her, "Careful, Miss Larch. Understand." He would not be able to protect her from this choice. She was not asking him to protect her. She was asking him to represent her. There was a difference. She wore the gray wool coat. She wore her hair braided flat against her head the way she had worn it every day on the mountain. She wore her mother's small silver cross around her neck under her collar, which no one could see, in which she did not need anyone to see. She sat down at the plaintiff's table beside Julius. She put her hands flat on the surface. She looked at the empty judge's bench. She did not look at the defense table, which was where Porter Kilgore sat with 2 associates in identical dark suits. She did not look at the gallery, which was where Horace Glassmeyer sat in his wool overcoat 2 rows back. She did not look at the second row of the plaintiff's side, which was where Mercy Ballinger sat in her Sunday dress with Ansel Wheaton beside her and Uncle Barnabas beside him, because Uncle Barnabas had insisted on being there and Dimity had after long thought allowed it. She looked at the empty bench. She thought about her father. Judge Harlan Cross took the bench at 10:04. The hearing began. Porter Kilgore opened with a motion to dismiss. Julius had told her it was coming. It was denied in 4 sentences. None of the sentences were warm. Julius called Deputy U.S. Marshal Gibson Heath first. Heath was precise. He was the best kind of witness. He stated facts in the order they occurred. He did not editorialize. He let the facts do the work. I described the internal inquiry into Renfred Fannon's handling of the survey reports at the Territorial Land Office. He described the specific mechanism. Mineral assessment sections omitted from county copies. Full reports retained in the Territorial Archive. 14 consecutive reports over a 22-month period, all with the same omitted section. He described Fannon's departure from the land office. Fannon's subsequent employment by a Helena-based mining concern. Kilgore cross-examined. He was smooth. He tried to establish that Fannon's data management was a filing error rather than deliberate concealment. Flat, the inquiry had characterized the omissions as systematic. A single error was an error. The same section removed from 14 consecutive reports over 22 months was a pattern. Kilgore tried 3 more angles. Each one landed the same way. Heath did not move. He did not raise his voice. He did not adjust his hands. Kilgore sat down. Julius called Elwood Pickens second. The room shifted, because Pickens was the county clerk from Birch Fork, and half the people in the gallery knew him, and they had most of them formed the reasonable expectation that Elwood Pickens would come to this hearing and would testify in the specific measured way of a small county clerk protecting his job. Pickens sat down. He looked at his hands. He looked up, quiet, into the courtroom. He had been the Birch Fork County Clerk for 19 years. He knew what the law required. He knew what it permitted. He paused. On the 17th of October last year, 2 days before Miss Larch had come to his office to inquire about the survey reports on the Frayne parcel, a man had come to see him. The man worked for Mr. Glassmeyer. Pickens had known this man for 11 years. He had suggested that if any inquiries came in about the Frayne property, Pickens might find it. He might find it useful to be thorough about locating the relevant records. Pickens looked at the far wall. He had understood what the man had meant by thorough. He had understood the word. He had been listening to that word used that way in this county for 19 years. He looked back at the judge. He had provided the records to Miss Larch. He had done it because she had asked. Correctly. and she had had a legal right to them. But he wanted the court to understand. What had been asked of him by that man had not been within what the law permitted, and he had been carrying it since October, and he would rather sit here and carry it in the daylight than carry it in the dark for another day. The courtroom was very quiet. Kilgore cross-examined. I tried to establish that Pickens might have misunderstood a routine request, that the word thorough might have been coincidental, that memory across 4 months was unreliable. Pickens did not budge. At the end, Mr. Kilgore, he had signed thousands of documents in 19 years. He knew what a request felt like, and he knew what a request felt like when it was not a request. That was not a request. Kilgore sat down. Julius called Mercy Ballinger third. Mercy walked to the stand in her Sunday dress and her sensible boots. She sat down. She adjusted her shawl on her shoulders. She looked at the judge. She looked at Julius. She looked briefly at Dimity, and she smiled small at the corners of her mouth in the specific way older women smile at younger women they have decided to keep. Then she started talking. She talked about Osmond Frayne. She talked about 22 years of laundry deliveries. She talked about the man's mind. She talked about the way he had read the newspapers she had saved for him from her older customers. She talked about the way he had asked questions. She talked about the day, 6 months before he disappeared, when he had come into her shop, sat down at her kitchen table, drunk his tea, and had placed a package wrapped in oilcloth on the table between them. She told them what he had said, word for word. She said gone home that afternoon and had written it down, because she had thought this was not a normal thing for Osmond to say. She should write it down while she remembered it exactly, and she had kept the piece of paper, in the same tin as the $10. She produced the paper from her handbag. She read it aloud. Mercy, if some honest person ever comes into this shop asking about me, give them this. If nobody comes in 3 years, burn it and forget it. She put the paper down. Quiet, that had been 2 years and 11 months ago, Your Honor. She had kept that package in a flour jar in her kitchen. She had moved it twice when she cleaned the shelves. She had never opened it, because he had not told her to open it. He had told her to give it, and in October she had given it to Miss Larch, because Miss Larch had come into her shop on her own 2 feet. And Mercy had decided, sitting outside the general store one afternoon, with a loaf of warm bread, that Miss Larch was honest. Julius entered the second copy of the assay report into evidence. With the territorial seal, Kilgore stood up. He was pale. He requested a brief recess to consult with his clients regarding the denied. Judge Cross did not look up from his notes when he said it. Kilgore sat back down. He cross-examined Mercy for 8 minutes. He got nowhere. Because Mercy Ballinger, at 68 years old, was not a witness that a Chicago-trained shark in a suit was going to intimidate with a raised voice or a strategic pause. She answered each question in her warm, dry laundry shop voice, and she did not blink and she did not stumble. At one point, when Kilgore attempted to suggest that her memory of the exact words might be embellished after 3 years, she simply reached into her handbag, took out the paper again, and held it up. Quiet, Mr. Kilgore. She had the words on the paper. From the afternoon it had happened. Would he like her to read them a second time so they could compare them to the first? Kilgore sat down. Julius called Ansel Wheaton forth. Ansel took the stand. He answered Julius's questions plainly. Length of acquaintance with Osmond Frayne, nature of the relationship, character of the man, any observations of impaired judgment. He had read every survey notice he could get his hands on, Ansel told the court. Not because he was paranoid, because he paid attention. He had been paying attention to that mountain for 31 years. He had known what the rock formations on the eastern ridge meant because he had read the same geology texts the survey crews used. He had found out what was there the same way they had. He had just not had anyone to report it to, and nobody had been checking whether he had. Kilgore cross-examined. He was at this point working with less patience than he had opened with. He tried to paint Osmond as an eccentric, a recluse, a man who constructed elaborate private mythologies about his mountain. Ansel answered every question the same way, flat, direct, without emotional charge that Kilgore could use as a lever. At the end, Kilgore asked whether it was not true that Ansell's attachment to the memory of the deceased had motivated him to support Miss Larch's claim, regardless of its legal merit. Ansell looked at him for a long moment. Then quiet his attachment to the memory of the deceased was the reason he knew exactly what his legal merit had looked like. And his legal merit had looked like 30 years of documentation. A valid mineral claim filed with a real record number. An assay report he had hidden on his own property because he had understood somebody was going to come for it. A second assay report he had left with a woman in town in a flower jar. A hand-drawn map. A journal. A letter. 6 names of people to watch. He had anticipated every argument Kilgore had made in this room today. That was not mythology. That was a man who had been more organized than anyone who had tried to take his land. The room was quiet. Kilgore had no further questions. He sat down. Julia stood up. The plaintiff called one additional witness. Mr. Theo Halbrook. Kilgore's head snapped up. The name was not on the pretrial witness list. Because Julius, on Dimity's specific instruction, had filed Theo Halbrook's name as witness to be called if available. Residence remote. Availability uncertain, a technically permissible designation for a witness whose appearance could not be guaranteed. Kilgore's team had quite reasonably assumed the witness was not going to appear. The witness appeared. Theo Halbrook walked down the aisle of the courtroom. He was wearing the leather coat with the restitched shoulders. He had trimmed his beard for court, not shaved it, trimmed it. He was carrying his hat in his hand. He took the stand. He was sworn in. Julius asked him 3 questions. Halbrook answered each one in his gravel voice. Slow, careful, word by word. Had he known the deceased Osmond Frayne? Yes. Had he been present on the mountain above Cutter's Creek on the night of March 12th of the year 1874? Yes. Would he tell the court in his own words what he had seen that night? And Theo Halbrook, who had not been to town in 3 years, who had refused to speak to Ansel Wheaton 4 separate times about that night, who had held his testimony inside his ribs for 2 years and 8 months. Theo Halbrook looked directly at the third-row gallery seat where Horace Glassmeyer was sitting, and he told them all what he had seen. It had been a full moon. He had been checking his lineup on the ridge above Cutter's Creek. He had heard voices, down the trail, below him. 3 men. He had not been able to see them at first because of the rocks. He had got quiet and moved to where he could see them. One of them had been Osmond Frayne. He had been walking in front. The other 2 had been behind him. One of them Halbrook had not known then. He knew him now. He was a man called Renfred Fannin who worked for a mining concern in Helena. The other one Halbrook had known then, and he knew him now. He was sitting in the 3rd row of this gallery in the seat next to the aisle. His name was Horace Glassmeyer. The room made a small sound. The judge did not gavel it down. He simply looked at Halbrook and waited. They had been arguing. Halbrook went on. He had not been able to hear the words. He could hear the tone. Osmond had been trying to calm it down. He had not been the loud one. Glassmeyer had been the loud one. Fannin had been reaching for something inside his coat. Halbrook's voice went slower. Osmond had turned to walk away. Glassmeyer had pushed him. Hard. 2-handed. Off the trail. There was a drop there. About 60 feet. Straight. Onto broken rock. He had gone off backwards. He had not had time to catch himself. Halbrook had heard him hit. Halbrook closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them. Glassmeyer and Fannin had looked over the edge. They had stood there maybe 2 minutes. They had not gone down. They had talked. Quiet. He had not been able to hear the words. Then they had walked back down the trail. Together, he said. He had waited until they had been gone, until the moon had moved. He had climbed down the goat path on the north face, to where Osmond was. He had already been dead. Halbrook had sat with him a long time. Then he had gone back up. He had not told nobody, because he had been scared. He had not been proud of that. But Osmond had been his friend, and he was owed the truth. So, he looked at Judge Cross. He said so. The courtroom was silent. Complete silence. Kilgore rose halfway to his feet. Flat sit-down, counselor. He would have his cross. Kilgore sat. In the 3rd row of the gallery, Horace Glassmeyer stood up. He did not say anything. He picked up his hat from the seat beside him. He walked out of the courtroom. Nobody stopped him, because nobody in the courtroom in that particular moment had any legal grounds to. He was not a party. He was a spectator. He was a spectator who was free to leave. He left. The door closed behind him. Dimity Larch, 20 years old, wearing her mother's gray wool coat, sitting at the plaintiff's table beside Julius Ardmore in a Helena courtroom in February of 1877. Dimity Larch did not turn her head to watch him go. She did not need to. She had felt him leave the way she had felt his laugh at the auction, which was to say, not much at all. Judge Cross took 35 minutes. Dimity sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her breathing at a normal rate, and she did not look at Ansel in the gallery, or Mercy beside him, or Uncle Barnabas beside Mercy, or Kilgore at the defense table making notes with an expression she chose not to interpret. She looked at the empty bench. She thought about Chester in the lean-to. She thought about the garden. She thought about Osmond's small, careful handwriting. His sentence about people sent away from places they thought they belonged and what they built afterward if they were stubborn enough. The judge came back. He sat down. He arranged his papers. Flat, the court found that the title to the Frayne parcel held by Miss Dimity Larch under the deed of sale dated October 1876 was valid and unencumbered. The mineral claim filed under record number 1974 MC00047 by the deceased Osmond Frayne was found to have been validly executed by a legally competent party. The claim had transferred with the property upon its sale. Miss Larch's ownership of both was hereby confirmed. He looked out at the courtroom. The challenge brought by the opposing interest was denied in its entirety. He set down his papers. Additionally, this court referred the matter of the systematic omission of mineral assessment data from the county survey records to the Territorial Marshal's office for formal investigation. The court further referred the testimony of Mr. Theo Halbrook to the same office for investigation of the death of Osmond Frayne. He looked briefly at the empty seat in the third row. The court noted that a subject of that investigation had left the room. The Territorial Marshal's office might draw whatever conclusions it wished. He rose. The courtroom rose. Julius put out his hand under the table. Dimity took it. He squeezed once. Quiet Osmond would have been glad. Quiet in return, yes, he would have. Horace Glassmeyer was arrested at the Wyoming border 6 days later. He had tried to run. He had not made it. I was returned to Helena. He was charged. The charges included conspiracy, fraud, and on the strength of Halbrook's testimony and 2 additional witnesses that Marshal Heath uncovered in the weeks that followed second-degree murder. Renfred Fannin offered a deal in exchange for cooperation, gave up Bertram Voss. Bertram Voss was charged separately in a federal action. The mining concern that had been quietly buying up mineral claims in the Upper Valley for 6 years was investigated, dissolved. Its assets were held in receivership. None of this happened fast. Legal proceedings do not happen fast. But by the middle of March, the direction of things was clear. And by the beginning of April, Julius wrote to Dimity that the extraction rights on her ridge had been offered on legitimate terms by a smaller Bozeman-based operator he had vetted personally. She signed the agreement on the 10th of April. The first proceeds arrived in July. Dimity rode down into Birch Fork on a Tuesday morning in the middle of April before the money came, before the extraction started, before any of the outward things had changed about her life. She rode down for a specific reason. She rode down because Mercy had written to her that Mabel Tipton had come into the shop the week before and had asked Quiet if Miss Larch might be willing to speak to her. Dimity had thought about it for 2 days. Then she had ridden down. Mabel was standing at her fence when Dimity rode up Main Street, as if she had been standing there most mornings that week, waiting. Dimity stopped Chester at the fence. She did not dismount. Mabel looked up at her. Quiet Dimity. Honey, I should have come to you that morning. I have been. I have been sick with it. Since October. Dimity looked at her a long moment. She thought about the turned head. She thought about her mother making tea. She thought about Osmond's line. Do not shrink for them when you go back down. Quiet Mabel. That was worth something. She would not say it was not. Mabel's face did something small and complicated. Come by the reading room next Tuesday. Mabel looked confused. What reading room? The one that would open in the fall. In the empty storefront next to Mercy's shop. They were going to teach people to read legal documents, deeds, contracts, mineral filings, county records, the things men in overcoats counted on you not being able to read. She was going to teach the Tuesday sessions herself. Mercy was going to teach the morning sessions for older ladies who had never learned to read at all. Uncle Barnabas was building the tables and chairs. It would be free, and it would be open to anyone. She paused, especially to women who had never got asked what they thought. Mabel's eyes filled. Quiet Mabel knew how to do things, whether she had been letting herself know it or not. She was to come Tuesday. Dimity could use her. She clicked her tongue at Chester. She rode on down Main Street. She did not look back. Because a person walking away from a fence does not need to look back to know whether the person at the fence is still standing there. She knew. Mabel Tipton was still standing there. Mabel Tipton would be standing there a while. Some things you cannot fix. Some things you can only let become useful. Dimity had decided somewhere on the trail down that morning that this was one of the ones you let become useful. The reading room opened in the fall. They called it the Frayne Reading Room. It sat in the building next to Mercy Ballinger's laundry shop, which had been the old dry goods annex empty for 6 years, which Dimity had bought outright with the third month's extraction proceeds and had repaired with Uncle Barnabas doing the carpentry. Uncle Barnabas built the tables. He built the chairs. He built the long shelf that ran the length of the north wall. He built a raised reading desk at the front so that Mercy, who was small, could stand behind it and see the whole room. He did not weep about any of it. He worked. He came up to the cabin every other Sunday for supper. Dimity made him coffee the way she made it now, strong, the way her father had never liked. He drank it. He did not complain. He asked about the garden. He asked about Chester. He did not ask about anything else. They did not become close in the way of people who had never wronged each other. They became something else. The kind of quiet, workable relation of two people who had chosen, both of them, to build a thing forward instead of dig a thing backward. It was Dimity thought more than she had expected and less than she had grieved for, and it was enough. Ansel came up the mountain twice a week. He kept coming up the mountain twice a week. Sometimes he brought supplies. Sometimes he brought news. Sometimes he brought neither. Sometimes he just sat on the porch with her and watched the light change on the eastern ridge and did not say anything at all. One evening in the second week of May, he was sitting on the porch and she was sitting beside him, and the sky was doing the particular quality of pink that Montana sky does in late spring when the day has been warm and the mountain has been holding the warmth. Chester was in the lean-to. Nobody was talking. Quiet Dimity. Yes, he had been coming up this mountain twice a week for 6 months. He had been coming for a reason. She did not look at him. She looked at the eastern ridge. Quiet, she knew. He did not answer. She watched the pink deepen over the ridge line for a long moment before she spoke again. Quiet Ansel. Yes, take his time. She looked at him then. Take all of it. He looked at her. He nodded once. He put his hand palm up on the porch board between them. She looked at his hand. She put her hand on top of his, not woven, not clasped, just her palm on the back of his. They sat like that as the pink went out of the sky. Neither of them said anything else that evening. There was nothing that needed saying. Time, which they now had. The reading room ran a Tuesday session that first fall. Dimity taught it. In her mother's gray wool coat, which she had let out at the shoulders once more, so that it fit her the way clothes fit a person who has been living a life. The first Tuesday 6 people came. 4 women, 2 young girls. Mabel Tipton was one of the 4 women. She sat in the back row. The second Tuesday 11 people came. By the 4th Tuesday the room was full, and Dimity stood at the reading desk with a copy of the county assessor's original description of the Frayne parcel in her hands, and she read it out loud, slowly, every phrase, structurally compromised, water source unverified, apparent value negligible. Then she read out loud the section of the substituted survey report that had been in the county file for 14 months before she had bought the parcel. Then she read out loud the section of the real report, the sealed one, the one from Mercy's flower jar. The two sections were different by one paragraph. Silver bearing, extraction viability high. She looked out at the room. Quiet this paragraph, right here. This paragraph was the difference between a girl with 34 cents in her pocket and a fair chance at not being lied to. She was going to teach them this fall and this winter to read for the missing paragraph. In every document a man in a nice coat ever put in front of them, in every deed, in every contract, in every will, in every mortgage, in every settlement. The missing paragraph was always the one that mattered, and the men who wrote the documents were counting on them to not know it was missing. They were going to know, and then they were going to teach the woman next to them. The room was very quiet. Mabel Tipton in the back row was writing in a small notebook with a pencil stub. Turn to page 1 of the deed she had passed out, and find her the paragraph they hoped she could not find. 6 pencils moved, then 11, then 22. Outside the window on Main Street, the light of Birch Fork on an ordinary October evening. Inside the room, 22 women reading a deed. Dimity kept the cabin. She did not build a house in town. She did not consider it. The extraction operation ran from May through October each year on the Eastern Ridge, and the proceeds paid for the reading room, and for Julius's 20%, and for a small salary for Mercy, who at 70 years old had closed the laundry shop and had donated the building to the reading room, and who was now paid to teach reading 5 mornings a week. And Dimity lived on the mountain. She lived there with Chester, who got slower but who did not stop because that was the general contract Chester had made with the world, and Chester was not a mule who broke contracts. She lived there with Osmond Frayn's journals, which she read in rotation 1 a year, so that she was always reading one of them. She lived there with Ansel 2 nights a week for that first year, 3 nights a week for the second, and in a small wooden ceremony held in Mercy Ballinger's parlor in the spring of the 3rd year every night after that. She did not shrink. She did not shrink in the courtroom. She did not shrink at the reading desk. She did not shrink at Mabel Tipton's fence. She did not shrink in her mother's gray wool coat, which she wore until the elbows finally gave out, at which point she cut the good wool of the back panel down and had it made into a much smaller coat for a little girl in town whose father had died in the winter of '81. The little girl grew up, learned to read at the Frayn Reading Room, sat at 15 years old on the reading desk platform beside Dimity, and helped Dimity teach the deed session. Her name was Verna. She had 34 cents in her pocket the day her father died. She knew what to do with them. She did not spend them on the mountain. She spent them on the stagecoach to Helena, where she walked into Julius Ardmore's office, where she sat at 17 years old, standing in the door with her 4 things in a canvas bag. Mr. Ardmore, my name is Verna. Miss Larch sent me. I want to read law. Julius Ardmore, who had been thinking for 2 years about who would take his practice when he stopped, put down his pen. Quiet Miss Larch has excellent judgment. Sit down. Dimity Larch lived a long life on the mountain. Ansel died before her. Mercy died before her. Chester died at an age no one had ever quite pinned down, but which everyone agreed was preposterous. The reading room in Birch Fork ran continuously. It moved into a larger building. It added a section on women's property rights. It added a section on labor law. It taught a woman named Della Watson to read a mortgage in a later decade, and Della kept her house. The eastern ridge of the Frayn parcel yielded silver for a long time. Then the vein ran thin. Then the mine closed. The land reverted to the estate. The estate, per Dimity's will, was left in trust as protected wilderness. Nobody drilled there again. The cabin still stands. It is small. The stone chimney is still straight. The stone ring pool at the mouth of the spring is still there. On the mantel in the original room, if you know where to look, there is a small frame photograph of a man in a wedding suit standing beside a woman in a plain dress. Both of them looking directly into the camera. Both of them serious the way people used to be in photographs. Beside the photograph, a small ceramic cup that once held tea. Beside the cup, a leather journal. On the flyleaf of this journal, in small, careful handwriting that is not Osmond Frayn's, in a different, later, slightly rounder hand, someone wrote, "The world decided I was worth $3. I decided the world was wrong. Then I spent every day since proving it. Not for me, for every girl still sitting on a bench somewhere with 34 cents in her pocket.